Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Savior King, the Master Tactician and the Queen of Liberation in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 66, Interlude. Edelgard didn't know who threw the brick at her. She'd been shaken awake in the early morning by Hubert, who was supposed to still be on bed rest to recover from Ash's arrow volley. He didn't give her a chance to chastise him. The citizens of Inver are surrounding the palace entrance. Some rumors from the battlefields have reached them, despite my best efforts. You must go and calm them, or there will certainly be a riot. Disbelief and alarm racked her like a wave. She'd hurried to make herself presentable, wondering when and how Thales had been able to try and poison her people's minds against her. There hadn't been riots in Inver after the suppression of the Hrym uprising or the insurrection of the Seven, despite the people's anger against the humiliation of their emperor. Arundel must have leaked the report on Petra's betrayal and Brigid's insurrection, Edelgard thought grimly as she scrambled to make herself presentable. He's still angry that Rhea survived the attack on Lake Totates and is now safe in the rebel army. Never bloody well mind that his men gave my troops the slip in order to capture her themselves. I want her alive for now and in my control, both for her blood and as insurance against the javelins of light. I need to once again make it crystal clear that I won't tolerate him undermining me and my army that way again. Her uncle had gone into a truly incredible fit of rage when he heard the report. She'd had to grab his arm to prevent him from physically, or magically, assaulting the hapless messenger. However, outside of that, he'd been calm as a still lake even as more and more bad news, including Jaritza and Hervang's capture, rolled in, merely giving new instructions and shifting his planning. Edelgard did not trust this confidence in the slightest. Which is part of the reason she'd sent Hubert and the Vestra army contingent to ensure Brigid's continued support after Petra was spirited away by Dmitri, followed by the enemy steadily moving towards her home. Brigid wasn't as large as Faergus or the Alliance, but renegotiating the island's loyalties with Petra as a bargaining chip would give them one less thing to worry about. Her uncle had glowered and demanded she send Bladed, that's what he called him. But that was nonsense. He was just trying to intimidate her. It was just some patchwork creation, and the creature's handler along with her most loyal man. It should have been a victory. A proper turning point. Finally, someone who was loyal to the cause with purity of purpose was at the head of the army, with a secret weapon to boot. The enemy couldn't afford to take their entire forces to Brigid, or leave their conquered cities open to be rescued. Yet it wasn't. Apparently Bladed had been argumentative. She didn't like the confused, concerned frown the handler had worn when explaining this at all, and despite having a clear advantage over Dmitri had either missed an opening to kill him or deliberately ignored it. Hubert was nearly shot to death by Ash and had to be evacuated, and Petra herself had rallied the Brigid men behind her before leading them into battle, on the side of Byleth, Claude, Dmitri, and the church. The result was a total defeat. Not nearly as many casualties as there should have been for how badly they lost, but if Dmitri was still too soft to fight effectively, she would make use of that weakness of his. Why Claude was indulging his desire to spare their enemies, she didn't know. Probably to keep him happy and their alliance at peace. It did not sting, Edelgard told herself as she walked down the hall toward the front gates of the Imperial Palace. It just didn't make sense. Why would Petra, who had fought alongside her, seen her conviction, her desire to improve things, her plan to rid them of the nobles who insisted on her people's subjugation, turn her back on her for the sake of a church she didn't believe in? It certainly didn't hurt, it certainly didn't make her afraid that Ferdinand and Caspar would betray her next, afraid that she was surrounded by enemies on all sides even as she prepared to turn their fortunes around. The shouting out front distracted her from her spiraling thoughts. Get back to bed, Hubert, Edelgard insisted, turning her head and scowling at the sight of her retainer still hobbling along after her, hand pressed against the still aching scars Ash had given him. You must recover to continue helping me. Edelgard, the people are restless, I'm worried. Hubert broke off with a grimace, then started to cough, leaning against a nearby pillar. Hubert, listen to her, Ferdinand said, putting a hesitant hand on his shoulder. You risk reopening the wounds if you strain yourself like this. He wouldn't have had to suffer through slow healing like this if Linhard hadn't decided that faith was more precious to him than them. Edelgard scowled fiercely and shook her head. Ferdinand, carry him if you have to, just get him back to medical, she demanded. The orange-haired boy nodded, for once not arguing with an order she gave. He'd kept insisting on giving advice that was all about falling back, giving up concessions to the kingdom and alliance in exchange for peace. Peace. There couldn't be peace until Fodlan was reunited as it was meant to be and the church uprooted. Caspar, Hubert rasped as Ferdinand slung one arm over her shoulder. Stay with Edelgard, protect her. You got it, just to lie down, Caspar snapped a little waspishly, his eyes a storm. The boy's usual boisterousness had been subdued to the point of silence ever since he arrived in Inver. He asked to go with his father to Faergus, but the latter refused, insisting he stayed home and safe. Without being on the front lines, he'd mostly served as one of her bodyguards, keeping Agarthans out of their war room and away from her bedroom. Edelgard knew, though he never said it aloud, that doubt wreathed Caspar despite everything she'd revealed to him about the false history they'd been fed and the truth about Nemesis and Sirius. It hadn't troubled her until now, until Petra turned her back on them without a word to them, without explanation or even a hint of what she'd been thinking. I won't need a guard, she muttered, they are my people, moreover, they are the people who chose me. They chose to support my ambitions, they chose me over the church. They are mine. Nevertheless, she was genuinely concerned that Hubert would squirm free of Ferdinand's grip and crawl back to her if she didn't take Caspar with her, so she gestured for him to follow her as she walked up to the double doors. Once she threw them open, Edelgard felt her eyes widen as the sight in front of her. Thankfully, long practice kept her from flinching back or otherwise displaying shock. The courtyard was packed with villagers, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers alike, shouting and jostling for space. The current of anger and confusion in the air was a tangible thing. The castle guard, thankfully currently free of Agarthan busybodies, had formed a wall between them and the gates. Many villagers were either trying to push past them or fiercely arguing with them, demands for explanations blurring with each other into a ceaseless, incomprehensible pandemonium. The guards seemed deeply uneasy and uncertain what to do. When she came out with Caspar at her side, the head guard visibly slumped with relief before quickly launching a spell into the air to silence the crowd and gain their attention. You stand before your emperor. Hail Lady Edelgard I. Hail! The guards shouted. Edelgard's eyebrows tabled as she heard the words echo across the crowd. She must be imagining things, but she hadn't thought it quite loud enough for the number of people who were before her. They did quiet down afterwards, however, all looking up at her expectantly. What is the meaning of this? She called out firmly, stepping forward to ensure that absolutely everyone could see her. Why are you gathered at the palace as though the enemy were at our front door? An uneasy noise rumbled over the people. Many looked at each other, considering. I know many rumors have been traveling the long distances back to us, Edelgard said calmly. Such tales would be warped and altered in the telling by those who now seek to steal our birthrights from us. I bid you to not dwell on what you hear, but instead on preparing yourselves to better support the needs of the army as our forward strategy changes. Don't dwell. A voice from the crowd shouted. What are we supposed to do when we're told that your alchemists destroyed Fort Mercers with our own people inside it? Edelgard's stomach flipped over. What? How could they have heard of that? She gave them the report of what happened herself. Why was this? Only those who were shown mercy by King Bladed or taken prisoner survived. We lost more of our own men and the old general without even slowing the army down. You sacrificed them for nothing. A ripple of shouting followed the words. The villagers at the front shoved at the guards again, forcing them to bring out their swords and lances to plant them in front of them, closing ranks. That is merely church rumor-mongering, Edelgard proclaimed easily. Alliance siege machines knocked a large enough opening in the walls that our enemies could sweep through unencumbered. Whatever noblemen and women fell there are on the blades of the rebels and usurpers. The church's men are doing what they do best, altering the truth to their own ends. I say to you That's when the brick flew out and struck her shoulder. She stumbled backwards, more out of shock than anything. Her armor ensured she barely felt the impact, and looked around wildly until she found several of her guards trying to force their way through the crowd towards a tearful elderly woman. Tell us the truth. She screamed up at her leader and savior, while Caspar gaped. My daughter sent me word of what happened. Fire fell from the sky and destroyed the fortress. She survived only by King Dmitri Bladed's grace, he spared her life and that of her battalion and sent them out of the fort mere moments before the fires destroyed it so completely not even the cornerstone remained. The goddess is with Archbishop Eisner. She spoke to her and warned her of your alchemist's weapon. Our own brothers and sisters were sacrificed for nothing. Another voice on the other side came out. Do not be swayed the words of war captives. Edelgard cried out, scrambling to the words that would explain what happened as she recovered from the shock. They have been coached on what to say with the promise of good treatment. You cannot trust it. Then where are the boys and girls who came to the capital to help find a cure for your Lord Father? A middle-aged man's voice cried in return. Bring them out so we can see them and know that they are still alive. Finding a cure. Wait, Hervéing had brought in vagabonds and troublemakers along with the prisoners who served as my demonic beast tools during the monastery years. Shit. Your family is preoccupied assisting our army achieve victory. You ought to be doing the same, lest the church begin to spread their poison beyond Faergus's borders again. Let us see them. Or is the story that came from Lord Hervéing's lands true? The middle-aged man demanded in return, refusing to accept the words that had buoyed his soul when she spoke the likes of them a mere number of weeks ago. Are the demonic beasts the alchemists have wrested control over truly transformed humans? Not the natural horrors that so often plagued us, tamed at long last. A young voice screamed from somewhere in the back. A flower girl asked what had become of her brothers, and Hervéing responded by attempting to murder her. Another voice piped up. King Bladed threw down Eridbar mere yards from his foes in order to save her and protect her from retaliation. This is not the mad boy you spoke of, he valued the lives of our people more than your chosen men. Lord Regan ordered his army not to pillage our fields or homes. His fellow lords and students gave minor compensation for what they did take. Why would he bother with that if he was the man who heartlessly tricked our brave men into kill boxes and other wicked traps? A third voice joined in. Where are our children? Bring out our children. Show us your men haven't done them harm. Tell us the truth. Voices rapidly surged from every part of the crowd. Caspar grabbed her shoulder and pulled her back a few steps, watching this with wide eyes. Edelgard, these people are going to riot. He hissed. Can't you find some of those people and bring them out here? They're all right, aren't they? I can't do that. She protested. Because they're long dead. I cannot show weakness out here. This isn't weakness, this is reassuring them that you're protecting them. Caspar retorted incredulously. You would all do well to remember who your emperor is. Edelgard shouted out at the crowd, shoving his hand away. The usurpers line and the opportunistic alliance gang lords are invading your homes with the intent of removing all chance of equality between people of stations, the good treatment of those of low birth, to hide the truth that the church has distorted for so long. You will lose all the freedoms that you deserve if they manage to overcome our resolve. For the sake of mankind, these battles must be won. You must harden your hearts and prepare for a bitter struggle. Only through victory can Fodlan be reforged and reborn. The crowd lowered their voices to a low hum, some still pushing at the guards. Then, stop lying to us. Another brick sailed out of the crowd, aimed at her. She ducked past it. And one of her guards, her loyal to the core men, those who she could finally feel safe around with the knowledge that they would fight for her to the last, shoved through the crowd and fatally stabbed the teenager who had thrown it. Edelgard couldn't see very well from her vantage point, but she was pretty sure he had been wearing a necklace with the symbol of Saint Macule. The response was electric. The crowd further back was frozen in shock and horror, while a woman slid down to his side, screaming in horror as she futilely tried to stop the bleeding. Then there was a scream of murderer, and a muscular blacksmith slammed his hammer into the face of the guard responsible, sending him flying backwards. That rage electrified everyone around him. They all surged towards the guards, wielding nothing but sticks and stones and their bare hands and sheer weight of numbers. The rest of the crowd was quickly swept up in the mood. Murderer turned into a chant, then a fearsome thundering war cry. Caspar grabbed her again and began dragging her backwards while Edelgard watched this unfold in shock and horror. Do not kill our own people! She screamed at the guards who were scrambling to form ranks. Have you lost your minds? Don't slaughter them. They are not our enemies. She was quickly pulled through the doors which were slammed shut behind her. Caspar panted, staring up at the windows above them with alarm and suspicion. "They're gonna start throwing things, Edelgard. I think you should go back to the throne room." "I'll go and find Ferdinand. He has loyal people here and he's well liked. He should be able to calm this down before it gets out of control, even more out of control," the teen finished fretfully, not looking even slightly enthusiastic at the idea of this riot turning into a fight. He bounced on the spot and then rocketed off, leaving a stunned Edelgard in the hallway. How long did she stand there? She wasn't sure. The thundering of her blood in her ears was the only sound she could hear. Like as if in a dream, the sounds of the riot seemed to be coming from miles and miles away. Her people. Her own people were under attack, by her men. How had this happened? How could it have come to this? Evidently she'd been standing there long enough to concern her guards. After a stone was thrown through one of the high windows, two of them took her and guided her back to the empty throne room, begging her to stay within and stay safe before rushing to join the others. She stared at the doors for a moment after they closed. She shook her head, biting her lip. "Caspar and Ferdinand will take care of it," she told herself reassuringly, even as her heart hammered away in her chest. Ferdinand is 5 times the man his father is, especially when dealing with the common folk. This won't be a massacre. It won't be. I won't be remembered as the emperor who waged war against her own people. Letting out a breath, she turned around and couldn't fully suppress a scream in time. Bladed and Frildarius were both sitting on the stairs in front of her throne. They looked as human yet horrific as ever, with a minuscule number of new scars on their pale, translucent skin. It was hard to tell what they were thinking, hard to look at them, hard to think anything but wrong when looking at them. But it seemed like they were waiting for someone. Someone other than her, given how Frildarius blinked a few times, and then gave her a scornful and contemptuous look. That snapped Edelgard out of her daze. Hot rage and loathing rolled over her like a tidal wave. Her hand went to the hilt of hammer, removing it from its resting place on her back and stalking towards them. "So this is how my uncle greets me now? With his corpse puppets? Not even deigning to meet me face to face, treating me like a child," she sneered. "I won't be intimidated by a pair of toys. If he thinks this gives him control over me Frildarius didn't even stand up. She merely cocked her head to one side, a lion in the field watching its target storm towards her. Bladed, in contrast, moved in a flash. Just as Edelgard reached Frildarius and swung hammer down, his hand latched onto her wrist like a bear trap and immobilized it. Edelgard snarled and moved to wrench her arm free, but it was like her arm was suddenly encased in hard steel. She couldn't find any purchase. Bladed stared down at her from beneath his inky gray bangs. Then he tightened his grip. The pain was instant and unbelievable. White spots filled her vision and she could hear the crunching of the bones in her wrist cracked in so many different places. She let out a raw cry, dropping hammer and sinking to one knee as her legs turned to water under the overwhelming shock. Bladed didn't even twitch from effort, merely releasing her and letting his arm fall to his side. Edelgard bit her lip hard, tasting blood from the effort to keep from either screaming or starting to cry from the sheer pain of this new injury. How did he have the family strength? Flee, he rasped. His voice struck her like a gong, the feeling of wrong intensifying tenfold. You can speak," she choked out, reaching out for hammer with her other hand. Bladed kicked the weapon, sending it flying to the far end of the room, leaving her completely at his mercy. Run, leave this place, leave them and their works behind," the behemoth told her. "Them? You mean the Agarthans?" She scoffed out in disbelief. "You're their meat puppet. A construct. And you're telling me to run away like a child? Leave my empire to your masters. Must obey, the geese punishes us, otherwise." Bladed raised his head a bit, his orange-red eyes piercing through her with burning intensity. You are still alive, can still save yourself, save your soul. Flee. I am the emperor," Edelgard responded firmly. She tried to stand, but an overwhelming wave of vertigo washed over her when her broken wrist moved. She bit her lip again despite the pain. "I do not flee into the dark like a common criminal. I have chosen the path that will save Fodlan. I will see it through to the end." Frildarius laughed openly. It was a rough, bitter, and mirthless laugh. She surged up from where she'd been sitting and strode over her, the arrow of Indra glowing in response to her surging magic. "You are no hero," she said scathingly. "You are just their tool, like us now. Stupid little girl, did you really think, when you saw their works and made use of their evil, that why you would ever be a hero?" "Rena," Bladed murmured. What? Am I wrong?" Frildarius scoffed. She's just like Nemesis. D drinking blood and C calling it righteous. M making her people, W who foolishly trust her, A accomplices to I it all. S save why your sympathy F for our descendants. W you compare me to Nemesis. Edelgard smirked faintly. Then I am the next king of liberation. Frildarius's expression bent somewhere between incredulity and disgust. You, truly know nothing. Nemesis C committed an unparalleled evil, Sirius was why your hero, why your salvation. We were the fools, who naively trusted him. A distant look crossed her face like she was looking at something far away, far past. Why you mock the idea that there are things you cannot come back from. That is what makes you a fool. A door opened. Both Bladed and Frildarius turned away from her, still, silent and at attention. Another figure walked into the room. He was just as horrific and dead-looking as them, a glowing orange bow strapped over his back. He didn't even acknowledge her, instead smiling faintly at the two like figures. "I would say I'm glad to see you again, but the situation makes happy seem wrong." It almost sounded like a joke. Whether that redoubled the sense of wrong again or simply maintained it, Edelgard was too full of pain and confusion to decide. Ren, Bladed reached out and touched his wrist. Frildarius moved to hover at his side. They woke you, because of Iondek, didn't they? Ren nodded. Do you think, the K-Kids can win? He questioned. Frildarius shrugged hopelessly. The three of them then walked from the room, a steadying hand on their new friend's shoulders. Leaving Edelgard alone again. She carefully balanced her injured arm, staring blankly at the purple-black discoloring that was forming between her hand and arm. She'd been assaulted in her own throne room, injured, insulted, and left on the floor without anyone coming to her defense. Her people were demanding answers and being swayed by this notion of Dimitri being some sort of merciful savior. She couldn't control them with her own words or prevent one of her nervous guards from skewering one of her own people. She had lost Mercers, lost Brigid and Petra, lost Hervang and his territories, lost cities all over. Some of her soldiers had defected over to Byleth and Claude and Dimitri, spreading word that would undermine the country's chances of victory. How had everything gone so wrong? She'd thought of every contingency. She had justice and the righteous cause on her side. She had taken power back from the Seven and had the weapons to kill the beasts. Yet, nothing was happening as she predicted it would. You're no hero. The words echoed endlessly. You're no hero. Why hadn't she just demanded prisoners and murderers be made into demonic beasts? Why hadn't she demanded these puppets defend Fort Mercers instead of attempting to trap and destroy all her enemies within it? She was trying to remember. She had a good reason, she knew she did. The pain in her wrist was making it hard to recall. Her people were dying, with nothing to show for it. Nothing. She came back into this throne room after all her siblings died and saw nothing different in the way the empire worked, the way the world kept turning. Nothing, no point, no reason, nothing good gained from the horrific work. She'd done something wrong. At some point she'd stumbled. When? Would all these deaths be for nothing, just like Dash? Edelgard gritted her teeth and gave her head a fierce shake. It wouldn't be pointless. It wouldn't be meaningless. She would give it meaning. She was far from defeated. Inbear was the key. When her enemies eventually came to steal her capital and kingdom, she would trap them inside and fall on them with all the power of a warrior with nothing left to lose. She would make the deaths of her people worth it. Every death in her traps and in the demonic beast program would be the blood that anointed the truth and right Fodlan. She would throw the Agarthans at Claude and his allies, let him weaken them for her so they couldn't go behind her back harming her people again. She would break their power over her and bring Adrestia back from the brink in one final series of clashes that would be remembered as the day Fodlan was saved from beasts and alchemists alike. Count Varley would create a distraction for the united army while she called their troops in. Byleth would do the world a favor and kill the man. While this happened, she would call the remainder of her army back and then they would prepare. She needed to find Hubert. They would plan this bitter struggle down to the finest details. This time she wouldn't lose. She couldn't lose, not to Claude, not to Byleth, not to Agartha and certainly not to those beasts. She wouldn't allow everything she sacrificed to be all for nothing. Chapter 67. NGH. See Claude, we could be seen, Dmitri laughed, pawing at the gorgeous brunette nuzzling and peppering kisses along his neck. He was pressed back against a large tree trunk, slightly removed from the laughter and cheer of the still ongoing party. Once Claude had finally run out of questions about Brigid, and the king had started to ask Petra questions about Edelgard's war and what she thought they should do next, he'd promptly gotten somewhat tipsy and started acting very affectionate. Dmitri decided they could afford to slip away for a few moments. The mischievous prince had been in his arms almost the instant they were out of sight, showering him with love and teasing. Apparently, wine made his prince clingy and affectionate. There was something to keep in mind, he thought through the pleasant haze. Claude pressed a kiss against his collar, pressing closer against him. Dmitri sighed contently and tightened his arms around him in response. "Shhh. You scared me. Give me this," his prince whined, digging his fingers into his shoulders. "I did. You were scrambling to keep up with a giant carrying a mirror Eridbar. I couldn't help without risking hitting you, and you think I wasn't scared." Claude pulled his head back and stared blankly at him. Dmitri's heart jumped when he saw the very real fear lingering under his usual humor. "You're silly. That's what you are, my silly king." He raised his fingers and gently stroked his lover's cheek. "I'm sorry." Touching their foreheads together, he lightly kissed Claude's soft lips. The taste of red wine lingered on his tongue, those green eyes were ever so slightly hazy when they parted. I thought he was my father for a moment." Claude blinked 3 times, instantly snapping into clarity and attention at the words. Warmth flooded through his chest. "It was irrational, I know, I saw my father die. His head was cut off. And yet, this man's face, he looked just like him, Claude, I swear it. It was like looking in a mirror." "You don't think that was by chance?" Claude asked. He frowned slightly. "Certain traits have always run in my family. In hindsight, I can remember some clear differentiating features of his, but they were minor, like the differences between father and son." Dmitri might have shivered if he weren't engulfed in Claude's comforting warmth. I panicked for a moment. Lost my footing, and he never gave me an opening to regain it." Claude hummed in understanding, and spontaneously kissed him on the nose. Dmitri gasped and collapsed into a fit of startled giggles. The brunette grinned at the sight before brushing his hair aside. "Don't apologize. We'll just take him on together next time he pops out of whatever dark cavern the Empire is hiding him and his friend in." Dmitri gazed at him for a moment, then shook his head in bemusement. "That battle truly frightened me. I've never fought someone who can bring the same physical strength I can to bear before. Yet when you smile at me like that, I feel confident again. It's an art." "It's you," he disputed in amusement, hugging him close again and kissing the top of his head. He didn't need to see Claude's face to know he was blushing. His poor prince still had trouble realizing the depths of his virtues. They stayed there for a moment, basking in the comfort of their closeness. Eventually, Dmitri broke it again. "He looked wrong, Claude," he murmured. It wasn't just his face. His skin looked grayed out, drained of all life. I thought the flesh might fall of his bones if I managed to hit him. His eyes, I swear the eternal flames burned behind them. And he hesitated. He said a handful of words to me, his voice rasped worse than someone who had swallowed smoke, fire, and glass. Everything about him was wrong, Claude. Even though he looked perfectly human if you didn't look closely." Claude frowned, disentangling himself from their hug to twist his braid around his fingers in thought. Bai said that the Falcon Knight had weird eyes, and the other strange thing about her was that she never made a sound. Not a grunt of pain when she was splashed with embers, no exclamation of surprise, nothing. She was silent as death in the middle of a battle. Theoretically that could be learned behavior, but somehow I don't think that's the case. His brow furrowed. This might sound a little odd, Mitya, but when you were fighting him, did you smell any rot? Dmitri shrugged helplessly. If there was, I couldn't pick it out through all the other stenches of the battlefield. Why do you ask? I don't know. But with the goddess and her children walking the earth, I've been remembering a lot of old spiritual tales from home. Claude crossed his arms. I hope it's nothing, and there's a rational, earthly reason for how unsettling this pair is. But he had a copy of Eridbar that didn't shatter upon clashing with yours. That's true, Dmitri acknowledged, his stomach twisting uncomfortably at the reminder. Which isn't supposed to be possible because the relics were handed down by Suthis to the elites. Claude lightly bit down on his right knuckle. I wonder. The Agarthats were around the same time Suthis was walking the earth. Do you think she might have taught them forging techniques that were lost after the cataclysm happened? You think Agartha forged the mirror Eridbar? I'm wondering. Claude paused, tilting his head. His frown slowly softened into a worried look. Can you hear someone crying, Mitya? Dmitri started, looking around the forest. It took a moment of focusing, trying to tune out the sound of the ongoing party in the meantime, but then, yes. That raw, familiar sound floated through the brush to him. Yes. We should dash. He flailed for a moment, unsure if he wanted to find Byleth or Marianne or Mercedes first. They were better at comforting others than he was, or just going, but Claude took the choice in his own hands and started cautiously making his way through the trees at a brisk pace. Dmitri hurried to keep up, wondering who was suffering from the pains of war at the moment. They were lead further away from the party by the sound, not out beyond the lights and music, but far enough away that those behind them probably couldn't hear or see them without searching. A soft golden green light curled in waves just above the ground. Dmitri's heart jumped in surprise at the sign of Suthi's presence. Are she and Byleth talking? He pondered. Claude started to step around a tree, gasped, and ducked so he was partially hidden behind a bush. He looked like he thought he should be moving away, but was too surprised, and too curious, with what he was seeing to move. Dmitri walked to his side and froze at the sight, his eyes widening. Lien, Indek, was weeping helplessly, leaning entirely into Suthi's arms like a child seeking reassurance. The goddess, borrowing Byleth's body and wearing her teenage appearance, had clearly been crying herself. Tear tracks stained her face even as she hummed and tried to sing to the green-haired archer. Her ambient magic was swirling around them, like she was venting her feelings out through it. Dmitri shied away from the scene, catching Claude's hand and trying to tug him away. We shouldn't, he mumbled. Claude, distracted from him, let out a small startled yelp and stumbled backwards, a dry branch loudly cracking under his foot. Suthi's head whipped around. Who's there? She demanded. Aha, sorry, Claude said awkwardly, stepping out into the open. The goddess blinked a few times, then visibly relaxed when she saw the two boys. We slipped off to take a break from the party, heard someone crying, didn't mean to stick our noses in, honestly. Oh, it's you two. Suthis let out a breath, relaxing. Indeka's sobs quieted a bit. He was clearly trying to regain his equilibrium at their appearance, though he wasn't having much luck. No, don't apologize for worrying. Heaven knows Dmitri can't help it. It was joke, but her smile didn't have the same level of snark and teasing that she usually provided. You startled us, that's all. They know. Indek hiccuped. Yes, they've known for a while. They're completely trustworthy, dear, I promise. Suthis brushed his tears away with her thumb, tucking stray strands of his hair behind his ear. He took a shaky breath and smiled weakly at her. Do you need me to stay longer? I haven't held Byleth's body for this long before. If you need me, I will. It's all right, mother. Indek breathed out, his words coming out mostly evenly. Dmitri's heart jumped in his chest and he heard Claude suck in a sharp breath. I'll be all right. Are you sure? Suthis fretted. I can stay. Indek nodded, giving her another brief hug before stepping back and fully straightening up. His smile was watery but consistent. He was still blinking rapidly to clear his eyes. I'm sure. Just knowing that you're here, close to me, is enough. He managed a wink. You can bring my little sister back. Suthies blinked rapidly for a moment, then smiled. Then she slowly vanished in a swirl of golden green stars, leaving Byleth in her place. His beloved slowly blinked her eyes open, light tears dripping down her cheeks as she looked up and regarded Indek. Dimitri's heart ached at the compassion and grief in her eyes, lying over a deep-rooted shock. She lifted one hand and pressed it over her mouth, seemingly unable to find words. Indek, rather than whatever she seemed to think he might do, reached out and ruffled her hair in a way not dissimilar to how he treated Bernadetta. "Thank you for bringing my mother back to me," he said warmly. Byleth ducked a bit and looked shyly up at him. Dimitri, feeling more intensely awkward than ever, wondered what to say. Indek didn't leave him thinking for long. Instead he turned towards them and asked, "There's a story I haven't told in a very long time. I hadn't realized how much I needed to tell it until now. If you know about Mother, I don't see any need to keep secrets from you." He tilted his head slightly. "You suspected who I was when we met, didn't you, Regan?" "Yeah," Claude rubbed the back of his head, uncertain smile. "I've been chasing bits and pieces of the story ever since I found a book of the elite's letters, including some written by my own ancestor. I found a lot of things that didn't make sense compared to what I'd been told, and," Claude trailed off and tilted his head. "Well, I really wanted to find out the whole truth, but I kind of feel like a jerk right now." Indek shook his head lightly. "I told Sirios that writing down an altered truth wasn't a cure, only a delaying action. But at the time I didn't have the strength left to argue with her on the matter. So it was her." Claude hummed, a brief pleased look on his face. That quickly fell away, though. "Hey, do you have any idea who that figure that Dimitri fought was? Or how what looks like an actual duplicate of Eridbar could exist? If Suthies gave the elites the hero's relics dash." The brunette stopped dead mid-sentence, taking an abortive step backwards. Dimitri didn't blame him. It only lasted a couple of seconds, but a look that was equal parts pure seething rage and unspeakable grief flashed in Indeka's eyes and his clenched fists. Meeting that gaze head-on caused the young king an actual stab of terror. The emotion was old and deep as an abyss. Indek noticed his slip, however, and took a calming breath. His expression softened again. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was always hard to hear, though I know that's what's been taught in the centuries past on my sister's command. McCule could never accept it." He shook his head briefly. "But I'm getting ahead of myself. Once we're on the ship back to the mainland, find me below deck, along with any of your friends who know about Mother. I'll tell you the whole truth." Those words gave Dimitri a chill. They stayed in Bridget another 5 days. It gave them a chance to relax, to rest, and recover from the marches and the stresses that had been following them since they left the Great Bridge of Myrden. Celebrations continued in a slightly more low-key fashion. Bridget was elated to be free of the Empire's grip and an independent kingdom once again, and showed comfort and pampering on them for making it possible. Dimitri had been given an herbal potion for his sleep troubles, and proceeded to rest better than he had in almost a year. Byleth had slept for even longer than him, spending most of the 5 days in bed and only sleepily rising to eat good, warm meals. With all the stress she'd been under, she needed this. They were hardly the only ones seemingly glued to their beds, thankfully. Rest was a running trend, both among his friends and in the general army. Lysithea had been brought into the medical wing due to Marianne's fretting, and what treatment she'd received had left her sleeping for roughly 12 hours. Felix tried to stick to his usual training regimen, only for a sleepy Bernadetta to cling to him after his attempts to rouse her and eventually pull him down to sleep on the floor next to her cot. At least, that was the story Felix gave him. The red in his cheeks and the way he stared over Byleth's shoulder suggested a somewhat different turn of events. Ingrid had all but tied Glenn to his bed, fretting over how he'd reopened an old scar from the tragedy during the battle. He'd protested its superficial nature to no avail. Dimitri had found them sharing a cot when looking for Petra. Ash and Marianne, while not spending quite as much time sleeping, had gone for leisurely walks and sat around admiring the landscape of Bridget without exerting themselves in the slightest. Hannah had apparently found them napping at the foot of a 1,000-year-old tree overlooking one of the beaches. Ignatz had taken the free time to do a painting of the Bridget shoreline. Flane had posed on the beach, waving happily overhead and enjoying the salty waves splashing against her legs. Sylvain had insisted Dorothea sleep and drink a lot to soothe her sore throat. Apparently there had been a lot of confusion between the various medical stations, leaving her, Yuri and Linhard with the unenviable task of keeping the medics and injured coordinated and taken care of. Given Dorothea's spirit was already weighed down by the tolls of war, it was no wonder Sylvain was worried. I wonder, when will he notice that his feelings for her have changed? I owe him for that nonsense on the Murden Bridge. Something to tell Claude, at least. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Atra had largely foregone extra sleep in favor of wandering the nearby forests and beaches, and begging whoever had a moment for stories from Bridget's history. Yuri had tagged along claiming that she needed a minder to eat and sleep, but Dmitri had a sneaking suspicion that he just wanted to be with her. Happy was napping out in the sunlight on one of the castle's balconies. Linhard brought her food and often joined her in sleeping. Constance, by contrast, was raring to know when they would be headed back to the mainland and was trying to keep busy, despite Rob's repeated encouragements that she take the chance to catch her breath. Dida was wandering the fields with Mercedes, the latter eager to see some of Bridget's flora and maybe bring some seeds back with her to the monastery when they eventually returned. Annette was sleeping with some calming tea. She'd had a close call in the last battle that had scared her something fierce. Dmitri was grateful that they'd taken the break, short though it was. He felt a little bad for asking Geralt's mercenaries to handle administrative matters while he rested, but Rob had insisted they could manage, and you're gonna have grey hair at 20 if you don't delegate some, Your Majesty. That's what we're here for. Petra and her grandfather had given them a large number of provisions as thanks for their help. It would go for miles to solve their supply problem. Assuming Rodrigue and Lady Judith had taken similar measures back on the mainland, they would have everything they needed for the final march to Inver. Petra had wanted to join them in taking Inver, but thankfully she'd eventually been argued down to standing by for the eventual attack on Shambhala instead. She hadn't been surprised to hear that the alchemists Edelgard had given mid-level positions in every corner of the army were a bigger danger than she proclaimed, though she had been shocked to discover where they were from or what they represented. I was not being told even slightly the truth, she'd confessed. I had been assuming that they were heretics and various enemies of the church. No one in the empire is knowing where they are from, they are doing anything they please and the common peoples are being very afraid of them. A little friend of ours said that street kids and other non-valuable individuals disappear whenever they stay in a village, Yuri had asked. Did you ever happen to see this? I am not being sure, Petra responded, gripping her arm as a dark look crossed her face. But I was waking a number of times in the night to be hearing of shouting and cries for help. There were a few alchemists in the unit watching me. Whenever I would be trying to investigate, men would be finding me and dragging me back to my room. Everything is under control, they would be saying. I'm not thinking they believed it. The words had sent a shiver down Dmitri's spine. At the end of the 5th day, Petra, her grandfather, an honor guard and a horde of civilians followed the united army back to where they'd left their ships. Young women had woven flowers into their hair or thrown garlands around their necks. Boys cheered and tried to stand up straightest to prove that they would grow up just as strong and swift. Dmitri had been embarrassed by the gestures, as well as Byleth. Claude had happily teased them both over it. With no more delays, they set sail back for Adrestia, with a free Bridget in the background and the final challenges of the Empire ahead of them. He's in deck. Hilda's strangled squeak caused Claude to burst out laughing, which caused her to whip around and scowl at him. It's not that funny, you jerk. She snapped, whacking him over the head with the bear plushie Bernadetta had made for him. If you say so, the brunette chuckled unapologetically, which naturally earned him another whack. Hilda went in for a third, but he dodged this one, waving a cheery finger. Be gentle with Bernie's gift. Felix was gaping, actually gaping. The look was so odd on his face that Dmitri was tempted to start snickering himself, looking between him, Claude and Byleth like he was waiting for one of them to fess up to the joke. Byleth merely flicked a strand of her golden green hair, the exact same color as Indeka's, over her shoulder after leaning over to hide her mirth. Felix stared at her for a few seconds longer before finally sputtering out, but how? Saint Indek lived 1,000 years ago. Lien, he looks like he's 20. He's the son of Suthies, why would he age the same way as us puny mortals? Yuri joked faintly. Dmitri suspected Byleth was pleased to see the sneaky mockingbird on the back foot. Claude was too busy laughing at Hilda to notice. Poor Bernie was standing stiff as a board, her eyes wide as plates, as she processed the knowledge that the kind man who'd given her his bow and generally doted on her was the saint whose crest she bore. Felix glanced over at her, then awkwardly put a hand on her shoulder out of concern that she would pass out. She didn't even seem to notice. One of the saints, Atra breathed out, pressing one hand against her chest. Fear flickered in her eyes amidst her awe. She seemed torn between bolting and staying rooted in place. Dmitri was confused by this for a second before it clicked in his mind. Of course she's afraid. Thales taught everyone in his domain to hate and fear the goddess, between that and her role in the tragedy. He jolted when he realized that he could think about her in that context without feeling a wave of anger and helplessness. When had that happened? And he's offering to tell us about the war? About that counterpart hero's relic. Lysithea was practically bouncing on her heels. Then what are we standing around here for? Seriously? Hilda protested, whirling to stare at her. Are you seriously not the least bit surprised that he's the freaking saint of the oceans and the stars? We met him in Lake Tutates. He had the inexhaustible. Claude was suspicious of him. Lysithea reeled off. He immediately took a liking to Bernie even though she tried to run away from him and gave her that bow without hesitation, and he had this faraway look every time he looked at Byleth or the sword of the Creator. I always knew he had to be more than just a monk. Hilda emitted a couple confused, frustrated noises before throwing her arms in the air and stomping her foot. Byleth giggled at the sight, causing the pinkette to give her a betrayed look. Did your mind seriously jump straight to Saint in deck? Did you ask in bemusement? I can't believe it, one of the saints is fighting alongside us, Ash stammered, wrapping his arms around himself. He looked overawed, stars in his eyes. Ah, that's such a comfort. I wonder what he sees in us, that he chose to leave Lake Tutates after 1,000 years. Why not ask him? Claude asked when he recovered his voice. He grinned at Ash's resulting squeak, blush, and attempt to hide behind Marianne. Dmitri amusedly noted that his beloved was enjoying the reactions so much it was overpowering his seasickness. He knows who that man Dmitri fought was? Marianne asked, her hands clasped together. A shadow crossed over her face. I guess, he would know Maurice too. The answer to all our questions is ready and waiting to tell us a story, Claude said happily. What are we standing around here for? Easy for you to say, Ash mumbled. Aren't you even a little intimidated by him, Claude? Hey, I've seen him treat Bernie like the adorable niece he finally got to meet, and that was when he wasn't reassuring Dorothea before the last fight started. How could I be intimidated by him after watching that? The brunette responded. Seriously, Suthies has talked to all of us, and you weren't scared of her afterward, were you? He's just as friendly as she is. There's nothing to worry about. That's true, Marianne acknowledged, coming out of the daze she seemed to be slipping into. She smiled slightly and gave Bernie a pat on the shoulder. Should we bring tea or something? Got that covered, Linhard said enthusiastically. He was all but bouncing in place, his eyes gleaming. Think about everything we could learn about crests from him. Is that really your priority right now? Atra asked, looking at him in bewilderment. Instead of the copy of Eridbar that strange man was wielding. Well, regardless of what questions should be given priority, Dmitri spoke up finally, letting a bit of his amusement float out in his voice. Bernie seemed to snap out of her daze at that. Felix instinctively tightened his grip on her shoulder to discourage her from running for it. She looked wildly around the room, up at him, and then relaxed ever so slight. Truly, Felix, just say the words. Knowing your feelings are reciprocated is the happiest you will ever feel, he thought in fond exasperation. Let's not keep him waiting any longer, shall we? Come, let's go. Lysithea insisted, grabbing Bernie by the arm and yanking her toward the stairwell to the upper bunks wherein Deck was waiting for them. The purple-haired girl squeaked and flailed a bit. Felix chased after them, an indigent look on his face. Dmitri exchanged amused looks with Byleth and followed after his friend, the others forming up around him. It was a short walk, though far enough away from the crew and the rest of the people on the boat that Indek felt it was secure enough. Dmitri was a little uncertain about not telling the rest of their friends about what they'd learned here. Claude took a more casual view of it. "We won't keep it from the others forever," he'd said. "Remember Indek offered to tell us everything once he figured that we had met Suthis? I think that's what made him feel comfortable enough telling us." His expression faltered at that. "Something terrible happened at some point. I wonder." "Nah, never mind." Indek was sitting in the living room that the hallways of the barracks lead into. Sure enough, there were a number of teacups set out in a basket full of bread awaiting them. He looked up and smiled at the sight of them. Bernie stalled again, forcing Lysithea to literally drag her to her seat. Ash stumbled to a stop, staring wide-eyed at him. Marianne hesitated too, gripping her hand like she was expecting it to transform into a claw simply by her standing in his presence. "I don't cut such a frightening figure, do I?" Indek asked softly, holding out a hand to Bernadetta. The purple-haired girl kept her dazed stare for a moment before hesitantly accepting it. Indek lightly tugged her forward so she was sitting on the couch next to him. Scowling, Felix strode over and dropped down on the couch on her other side, avoiding the saint's eye. Indeka's eye twinkled with faint amusement, and a knowing look. Marianne hesitantly stepped forward, and then froze again, ducking her head so her hair fell in front of her eyes. "Why, oh, of course, her crest." "Marianne." Dmitri hesitated and then placed a hand on her shoulder. "Suthis doesn't reject you," he reminded her gently and quietly. "Neither will he." Marianne's breath hitched. Ash tugged lightly on her arm, clasping the hand that bore her engagement ring as a gesture of support. That seemed to be enough. The blue-haired priestess smiled shakily and approached the chair set out for her. Indeka's brow furrowed with concern at the byplay. Dmitri wondered if he could, or should, convince Marianne to tell him about her crest later on. A few moments later, they were all sitting in a circle around him. Claude was leaning forward eagerly. Byleth sat next to him, one hand on his shoulder, looking equal parts bemused and curious. Dmitri thought he could see Suthis' eyes flickering in her green orbs, still fretting over her son. "Where to begin?" Indek mused. "The Arid bar copy you saw that man wielding, well, to explain it, I suspect I have to go all the way back to the beginning. Else there will be confusing holes in the story." He leaned back in the seat. "You know about the Cataclysm, a mysterious event that destroyed all civilization, yes?" "Yup. It was Agartha, wasn't it?" Lysithea asked, crossing her arms. "They blasted Fodlan with those javelins of light, set it all on fire, and were surprised to discover that was a stupid fucking thing to do." Indek snorted in amusement. "Well, they had help being stupid." "They did." Ash tilted his head. "Who else was Dash?" "It was Laputa, wasn't it?" Atra broke in, a knowing spark in her eyes. "I was taught about them. They were the other great human kingdom of that era, proud of their art and poetry, and they, her courage slipped away when Indek turned toward her, her head dropped and she stared at the floor. "That's right. You're a refugee from Shambhala, aren't you?" Indek asked gently. She gave him a small nod in response. "It took me a while to really notice you. You were so naturally a part of these community I wondered if I was imagining things." He reached over and touched her knee, causing her to start and look up at him. "You're a very brave person, not just to escape from that city but to take up arms against it. I greatly admire that in you." Atra's eyes widened, she started to respond, stopped, then stared at him. "There's no need to be so stunned. You're hardly the first refugee from those kingdoms that I've met, but you're a rare person even among them." Indek sat back again, a distant look in his eyes. After the war between Agartha and Laputa escalated in spite of their protests and warnings, many fled from both cities, seeking refuge with Mother and the family in the very place that Gareg Mach now stands on. We took all of them in without hesitation. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Claude took a sip of tea, looking like all his dreams had come true. Indek seemed amused by this and started his tale in earnest. Mother had come to Fodlan many generations before that, when those kingdoms were well off but still lacking in a greater understanding of the world. She had been traveling amongst the stars for a long time, and she was lonely, seeing a young but strong civilization called to her soul. She descended and offered them the vast expanse of her knowledge to improve their lives along with the lives of their families and friends. They accepted it happily, and grew rapidly with it. Many countries came into existence as a result, but the biggest and the greatest, the two who lived in the heartlands of Fodlan, were Laputa and Agartha. For generations, there was happiness and a close affection between them. Mother loved them, helped their souls on their way when they passed, and treated many like family. Eventually, she said it was a conversation with a Laputa poet that put the thought in her head. She began to birth children of her own. His eyes softened with memory. Angharad was the oldest, after her was Shiva, Dagon, Ra, Anubis, then Makul and Isikal and Sirios came afterwards, along with Artemis, Vishnu, Cronus, Typhon, Fenrir, Freyr, Aisling, Thetis, and Selene. Mother ensured that we inherited various strengths of divine magic so we could heal and tend to the world the way she did. I can still remember the awe in those children's faces when I moved the sea before them for the first time. Many of us took human spouses, too, sharing out blood with them so they could live out long lives at our sides. It was too painful to think of our beloved ones leaving us in what felt like the blink of an eye. We can't travel to the heavens as easily as Mother can. We're part mortal, since we were born in the mortal world. So you're demi-humans of a sort? Yuri asked hesitantly. There was a word that I didn't think I'd ever associate with him. Indek shrugged slightly. Clearly he hadn't given it too much thought. More divine than mortal, but we inhabit ultimately mortal bodies. We can die, though it's tremendously difficult to push us to that point. We can, like Mother, go into a deep sleep to heal would-be mortal wounds, but we can't afford to be discovered while we sleep. Wow, Bernadetta breathed out, clutching her finished dragon plush against her chest. That's amazing. Atra put her hands on her knees. They were trembling, Dmitri noticed faintly. Of course. What was I expecting? Why would I think that Thales and the men who came before him needed a good reason to hate the goddess? I know better now, so why? You were raised by him, Atra, Byleth said quietly. All that you knew came from him. It's hard to forget words that you hear every day of your life, even if you know they're wrong. Of course they fed you lies, Indek muttered. Why, if you'd known the truth, you would not inherit their hatred and resentment. You would be free to live your own life rather than be shackled to the ghost of that war. Why did Agartha and Laputa go to war? Dmitri asked. Surely they wanted for nothing with the goddess walking among them. Indek sighed heavily. To be honest, I don't remember what started it. I don't know if it was overshadowed by all that came afterwards, or if it was so petty that everyone, including those who started it, lost track of it. What I do know, is that the alchemists of both kingdoms had become obsessed with immortality and transcending humanity into a divine form. They started off with good intentions, wanting to blunt the sufferings and struggles inherent of the mortal world, but at some point, it turned into a poisonous obsession, and one that quickly spread throughout both their populations. He glanced at the ceiling. I think it might have been started when one Laputa alchemist claimed to have cracked the secret, and the highest-ranking men and women of the kingdom rushed to take it. An Agarthan spy stole his formula, his brow crinkled. Or maybe that was just one of the inciting incidents. Maybe it was the start of hostilities. I just can't recall. But a war began against them. Mother initially attempted to broker peace, disturbed at the thought of a continent-wide war with the weapons and knowledge they now possessed. Despite her efforts, they wouldn't budge, and worse, they eventually began to interpret her desire for peace as her withholding immortality from them, that she was hiding the secrets of godhood to keep them dependent on her. He shook his head. Nonsense. Mother had never withheld knowledge from them before. She freely allowed us to share our blood with our dearest ones to extend their lifespans by centuries. She was always improving medical sciences, and she rejected holding administrative power over humans, though they had offered it many times. She preferred to live among them like family, not as their overlord, and so did we. Though that's not to say none of us held positions power, he smiled faintly at a memory. Angharad ran one small city-state after throwing out the tyrant who had been slaughtering his own people for some time, while Shiva and Selene crossed the ocean to stomp out the slave trade that had sprung up there. They ran a government there for 200 years, remaining until they were certain it wouldn't return upon their departure. Makul ran his own school, that was where he met his wife, Izhame. Mother fretted a bit about it to an extent, but never intervened. None of the scriptures mentioned Mikhail as a teacher. Dmitri noted, faintly startled. He was described as a cool and taciturn man. Sikal was the one who reached out and taught everyone who came to him. Indek sighed heavily. Old sorrow passed through his eyes. Well, there's a reason for that, I'll get there eventually. Claude was leaning forward, almost vibrating. I should have brought my journal, he complained. I better remember all of this for later. That startled a chuckle out of the saint, which made Byleth, and likely Suthies within her, smile. Then Claude's eyes grew really wide when something struck him. Hey, which ocean did Shiva and Selene cross? This one, or the ocean pass into Almira? Almira, that's what the East is called now, right? Indek asked. I haven't been in those lands for ages. Yes, that's where they landed. A faint shriek left Claude's throat. He sank back in his seat while the entire room stared at him. All right, his prince stammered. That is interesting. It is. Hilda asked, puzzled. Very. Claude insisted, quickly recovering. Bernadetta tilted her head and gave him an entreating look. The brunette winked at her and mouthed out, tell you later, promise. Anyway, sorry for interrupting. It's fine, it gave me a chance to gather my thoughts. Indek glanced at Byleth. You said you saw one of Mother's memories in a dream, and the javelins were in it. Byleth nodded. Why yes. When you said the name Izhame, I remembered, she had been leading refugees into the original monastery. And her son with Mikhail was there too. Lien, you were borrowing his name, weren't you? Yes. I was, very fond of him. He was a sweet, energetic boy, always making me and the rest of the family laugh. Indek clapped a hand over his mouth, taking a deep breath in and out. I'm glad you got to see him. He should be remembered for how brave he was, how happy and ready to help. Bernadetta hesitantly reached out and clasped his free hand, squeezing it comfortingly. Indek let out a cleansing breath and smiled at her. Thank you, little one. He closed his eyes. Now, where was I? At first, we stayed out of the war. Conflicts had come and gone over the years, nothing between such big powers, of course, but we'd weathered them and bound up the wounds afterwards. We initially thought it would be no different. His expression darkened. We were quickly dissuaded of that notion. Agartha and Laputa escalated every step of the conflict, turning more and more of the knowledge Mother had shared with them into weapons against each other. They created poisons, weapons that cut wounds that couldn't be healed easily, fires that couldn't be doused in water, until finally they created the javelins. Heaven's spears, they called them. There was nothing heavenly about them. Yeah, put that together when they tried to hit us with them at Fort Mercers, Yuri noted, wincing. I really don't want to think about what would have happened to us if Byleth didn't have the power to turn back time and tell us to book it. Thales said that they were discarded years ago. Atra tapped a finger against her armrest. It makes me wonder if he was afraid of how everyone would react if they knew they still existed. He has such control over everyone in the city, yet he still hid this from them. Indek snorted. Oh, he was right to be afraid. The two kingdoms threw these weapons at each other with reckless abandon. With no plan for how to cleanse the soil and the water of a taint so toxic grass and weeds can't grow and a single drink poisons you to your bones. No consideration for the haze they threw up into the sky, poisoning the rain and blocking out the sun and the stars. They were so determined to win that they didn't consider how they would survive afterwards. It was the fruit of all of Mother's knowledge, bastardized into something utterly horrific. He shook his head. The use of these weapons broke many of their people from the spell the desire for godhood had cast. They fled in droves, begging us for shelter, while the two kingdoms continued to war without a care. We rescued everyone we could reach and brought them to the one place conflict had never dared touch before, the monastery in Suthi's Canyon, where Mother had built our home. That's madness, Ash shook his head vehemently. What's the point of winning the war if you've destroyed the lands you wanted to protect? If you've killed everyone you wanted to save? What would anyone gain from a dying world? They were so obsessed with a glorious future, they burned the present to obtain it, Marianne murmured. Couldn't they see that if they did so, all the future would hold as ash and ruin? Madness is right. I could never trust somebody like that, Hilda said, pumping her arms in frustration. You can't expect sense out of senseless men, Felix said, annoyed at the mental image he was getting of the two warring kingdoms. They would have just assumed that if they could create the javelins and their effects, then they could reverse them too. Too obsessed with the notion that he could do it, they didn't wonder if they should do it. Didn't think long enough on what would happen if they were wrong. Idiots. Atra looked down at her hands. Yuri reached over and lightly smacked her knuckles, causing her to snap her head up and glare indigently at him. He smiled slyly and responded, "You're shouldering blame from men 1,000 years dead. Which one of us is being silly right now?" She blinked in surprise, unable to find a response. "Listen to him, Atra," Indek said lightly. She looked at him in disbelief. "There's nothing sillier than placing responsibility on the children of those who did wrong. It's not just cruel, it makes no earthly sense." "Indeed," Dida rumbled. His eyes were closed in concentration, clearly pondering the implications of the story he was learning now. The war scoured life from Fodlan, and spilled out across both sides of it. Indek said bluntly. Byleth winced, shutting her eyes. Was she seeing Suthisa's memories of these horrors, stirred by Indeka's recollection? Dmitri reached over and grabbed her wrist reassuringly. "We saved everyone we could, but often we were too late, and even then we were running out of safe places to hide them. When the war continued in spite of this, and came right up to the monastery's door, finally, Mother would wait no longer. She destroyed the two armies there and warned them that if they returned, she would not be so merciful." He let out a sharp, angry breath. "They decided that the only response to that was to combine their armies and attempt to kill her. End her control over humanity, they said." "Seriously?" Bernadetta burst out, eyes widening. That's not just wrong, that doesn't make any sense. She's telling them not to destroy Fodlan. How did they somehow twist that around into everything being her fault?" "Unbelievable," Dmitri muttered, shaking his head. Disbelief warred with fury at their careless cruelty within him. How could they spend their people's lives so easily? Attack the goddess who gave them her knowledge and treated them as her family. In the face of that, Mother did the only thing she could do to save what was left of humanity, to end the war before it consumed all living souls. She did it reluctantly, sadly, but she did it. Indeka's eyes flashed. She stopped holding back, and she wiped both kingdoms from the map. Silence. Dmitri felt a chill go down his spine. He could hardly imagine those days and that final act, and what images he could draw were terrifying. Some of them survived. Shambhala, for instance, used a defensive mechanism to retreat deep beneath the earth at the last second. Laputa had a few disconnected towns that broke their defenses surviving the blasts, but apart from that, all that signified that they once existed was wiped away like it had never been. After that, Mother went about the world, purifying the lands of the horrific taint. However, the nature of the powers that created them, drawn from her own divine knowledge, and the sheer scale of destruction meant that the task was taxing on her. She didn't stop, however, she went about her way, reviving the world and finding some survivors in the rubble. Once she had successfully completed her task, she returned to the shrine beneath the monastery and fell into a deep sleep. Indek tilted his head and gazed at Byleth. "You've been there, right? Within the holy tomb." "We all have," Dmitri whispered. Indek closed his eyes. "You've seen the golems, then, right? When you searched for the chalice of beginnings. At that time, her family placed them within the tomb and assumed they would be enough to protect her. Then we spent some time rushing about Fodlan, trying to restore a semblance of order and civilization." He grimaced at the memory. Those years were an endless nightmare. Bandits and warlords tore each other apart for control over fiefs with innocent people caught in the middle. Children came home from foraging to find their farm burned and their parents' corpses stuck on spikes. People were desperate, doing whatever they thought they needed to in order to survive, no matter how awful. We helped them form somewhat stable towns and trading routes, routinely returning to the monastery to check on Mother, and on our families as well, who had taken up residence in the canyon. For a while the work was exhausting in both body and soul, we thought everything would turn out all right. But we were wrong. There was an edge of pain in Indeka's voice now. Byleth moved her chair a bit so she could reach out and pat his arm, worry in her eyes. He managed to smile at her. It's all right, little sister. It's almost a relief to finally explain what really happened. What really happened? So Sirius lied, Claude said. He looked pleased for a moment, vindicated, even, before his face fell in confusion. Wait, but Sirius was your sister. Why would she tell a different story from you, Sickle or Macule? Hilda smacked his arm. Well, maybe if you'd quit interrupting, we'd find out. An awkward but real burst of laughter flooded the room for a few blissful moments. Even Indek chuckled, his posture relaxing ever so slightly. But it didn't last. His eyes grew distant, and darkness spread across his expression. You were told stories about Nemesis, who was called the King of Liberation. Originally, he had no name, he was just another child born into the chaotic and blood-stained world. The life he led in such conditions, I would not wish it on any living soul. He survived by making himself strong, irreplaceable for the bandit gangs and warlord armies that he was sold between. He was treated cruelly and frequently lived life with his death a mere breath away, all the while hearing stories about the fabled goddess, who had power over life and death, who could resurrect a dying world. I think he couldn't accept that Mother could be so benevolent, so loving, when his life and the lives of those around him were characterized with such horror and brutality. The saint shook his head violently. If Mother could have healed the world and still retained the strength to help the survivors, she would have. It just wasn't possible, even for her. The damage, it was just too widespread, too complete. She had taken a mortal form. It couldn't bear the weight of all her powers. I believe that, Lysithea said softly, with pure, sincere understanding. Dimitri couldn't help but give her an odd look. She avoided returning his gaze. Indek breathed out heavily. Shambhala survived, as you well know. Even though it was her last resort, they hated Mother for killing their kingdom to save the world. They tried to send strike teams to kill her in her sleep, but none of them could bypass the golems, and we often returned soon enough to chase them out. But, Nemesis spotted them at one point. I don't know how. He shadowed them to the holy tomb, watched them fall to the golems and us appear to chase them off. Indek stopped, and took another drink of tea. His hands were shaking a bit. He waited there. He was astounded that Mother was real, and sleeping while Fodlan suffered. He decided that if she would sleep through this, then someone needed to take her place. I don't understand, Marianne whispered. She was shaking a bit too, tense as a bow. Was she feeling that same creeping dread that he was? Nemesis was clever. He watched the Agarthan strike teams fail, and figured out how to bypass most of the golems, and destroy the few he couldn't avoid. He reached Mother's body and he swallowed hard, and said the words that dropped the floor out from underneath Dimitri's feet. He cut her heart out and drained her blood. He killed her mortal body. There was a single, perfect second of silence. Then. What? Dimitri couldn't hear his voice among the explosion of noise. How? Why? That can't be. How is that even possible? He killed Suthis. He stole her heart. I don't understand. But he was sent to save Fodlan. How could he? The only one of them who wasn't joining in the babbling like a bunch of frantic ducklings was Atra. Her hands had snapped to her mouth, her eyes widened with horror, and tears were forming in the corners of her eyes. She expected something like this, some small part of Dimitri's brain noted. She truly believes some people are capable of anything. Indek waited for them to calm down, or maybe he was letting them vent their horrified confusion and realization while regaining his bearings. Dimitri remembered watching his stepmother leave him and vanish into the fires of Dusker, tears in her eyes. That was how Nemesis came to possess the crest of flames, the saint said in a hollow voice. Dimitri remembered sounding like that during those first days back in Ferdihad after the tragedy, when he could bear to speak at all. His heart hurt for the demigod before him. That was how he became Fodlan's de facto ruler. There are stories of him defeating monsters from the north, that was also true. The babbling died down at this, everyone letting him say his piece. Claude was sitting forward, rapt with attention, but the joy that he usually exuded when learning hidden truths had vanished. I'm not sure how they came about, but the first demonic beasts, they appeared after the cataclysm. Whether they were some sort of creation of the Agarthans experiment, or if they had been there all along but kept away from humanity after Mother arrived, I don't know, but they began appearing in droves. We could destroy them easily, but we were one family, and often spread out. The humans they encountered simply couldn't contend with them. Before him. That's why he was first called the King of Liberation. Did the Agarthans find out that he killed Suthi's mortal form? Dmitri hesitantly asked. Indeka's expression momentarily became one of fury and hatred. It made the young king tremble. Bernadetta flinched away, and Atra instinctively cowered. The saint closed his eyes and focused on his breathing for a moment, then gave them an apologetic look. Forgive me. He straightened up again. The pain still lingers, even now. Yes, they did find out. They came to him and demanded he join them. Nemesis wasn't impressed. Powerful as he now was, he destroyed their strike teams with contemptuous ease, leaving only the alchemists. Pathetic as they were, they begged for their lives. Nemesis was only swayed when they swore they could construct weapons for him that would have no rivals. Even then he swore to kill them if they failed to impress him. Serves them right, Bernadetta sniffed. She looked like she was close to crying. Marianne wasn't much better off. Indeka's expression softened. He patted her hair. Felix let this go without a jealous look. He was more troubled than Dmitri had ever recalled seeing him. Take all the time you need, Byleth said, her voice barely a whisper. I hope you aren't feeling guilty, little sister. That's no less silly for you to feel than Atra. Indek rasped, amazingly finding a kind smile to give her. If Mother's heart was placed inside your chest to save your life, I think there is no better place for it now. Byleth pressed her hands against her chest, timidly smiling back. They took Mother's bones and what remained of her blood that Nemesis had not drunk. They returned to their forge and worked for 8 days and nights. Nemesis waited, growing increasingly impatient. It was at this time that he called for the teenagers he had slowly gathered to his side as he traveled from one nightmare to another. 10 who had lived some time with him, as well as another who had been in the hands of Agarthans before Nemesis killed them and swept him away. Maurice already bore a crest at that point. Indek clapped a hand over his mouth. Maurice? Marianne asked in a small voice. I am sorry, I bear that crest. I met him, warped into that terrible demonic form in Edmund Woods. Do you, did he, was he? You bear the dash. Indek looked at her, startled. Then sorrow crossed his face. Oh, you poor girl. He stood from the couch, crossed the room and lifted her into a tight, compassionate embrace. Marianne gasped, having clearly not expected that reaction. You inherited suffering that was not meant for you. The way they killed Ishame and Elien, Byleth gasped, the blood draining from her face as utter horror filled her expression. Dmitri thought he might throw up himself. She'd said that Lien was just a child. They struck him with 2 javelins of light. He had powers the most like Mother's, in the abilities his dragon form possessed, but the toxic fire of the javelins, it poisoned his blood. Maurice, oh, I think he didn't know. His reaction when McCule confronted him years later makes little sense otherwise. Honestly, in retrospect, I wonder if many of them didn't know. But regret, not knowing, wouldn't save him from the poisoned flames. No one but Mother could. The blood he consumed was poisoned, and it was passed into him. He said that, Marianne whispered in realization. The lance that flew through the sky poisoned blood and bone. It wasn't a curse. No, it wasn't. Come now, Indek laughed shakily, I couldn't call myself a saint if I cursed his innocent children to the fate that befell him. The toxic flames, they warped Elien's powers when they passed on to Maurice. It destroyed his ability to control his transformations, and warped his dragon form into something twisted beyond all recognition. It gave him control over demonic beasts, but it also destroyed his mind. And that poison, it was passed to all the children who inherited his blood, so they too. His voice cracked and he gently placed Marianne on her feet, having lifted her up. I think little sister can heal you, once Mother remembers how she purged the toxins before. With Mother's heart, her mortality, she would have the power necessary. Don't give up, Marianne. So the family never brought disaster, Claude muttered disbelievingly. They just has a disease that ran in the bloodline. Goddess dammit, he hit his hand against his leg and lowered his head so his bangs shadowed his face. Indek brushed the beginnings of Marianne's tears away, gently coaxing her into Ash's arms before returning to his seat. After 8 days, the alchemists returned with one singular blade, though now I suspect they made two, and hid the second along with what of mother's blood they were able to extract. That was the sword of the Creator. Wait, so they really are bones? They're made of bones, Hilda slowly started before suddenly turned green with mortified realization. Oh my goddess, I was joking, I know I said it pulsed like it was alive but it was just a stupid joke. They can't, are they all? She fumbled for words, like she couldn't quite bring herself to state the dawning realization that was hitting everyone who held a relic. Dmitri felt his jaw drop open as it struck him. His stomach rose in revolt, he gagged and swallowed hard, twisting his head to the side so he wouldn't vomit on the table if he couldn't contain it. Linhard slumped back in his seat, so horrified he couldn't even muster a response. They were forged by human hands, by human genius, not granted by the whims of a goddess, he breathed out, his eyes wide with horror. Burning flames, did she know? Did she know all along and still think? What is wrong with her? Indek stiffened. Who said that? He demanded, his voice cracking like a whip. The Emperor, Linhard said, too dazed with nausea to even be scared. I suspect she got that lie from the alchemists now serving her. She couldn't have, Dmitri choked out between gagging, the nausea was so intense he didn't think he could contain it. Felix rapidly grabbed the nearby trash can, wrenched the bag out to drop it in a corner, and stuck it under his head. Surely she can't be so cold-blooded as to. It's not true, Ash asked in a small voice. Is it? All the heroes' relics, they couldn't have all been forged from Suthi's bones. The note of weak pleading in his voice was underscored by heartbroken disgust. Indek let out a shuddering sob. Then he whispered, no, they weren't all forged from mother's body. Dmitri didn't need to ask any other questions. He understood right away. Claude bleakly whispered, that's why the Red Canyon is what it is. Red from rivers of blood. That imagery, that realization, mingled with the fiery memories of the slaughter of his own family, and Dmitri lost the battle with his body. He started to throw up, feeling like he'd never stop. Dmitri didn't remember how he ended up looking out over the bow of the ship, Eridbar in his lap, watching the sun rise. He vaguely remembered a whole lot of sobbing, crying, irrational pleads for forgiveness. Indek insisted there was nothing they needed to ask forgiveness for, insisted again and again they weren't to blame for believing what Sirius had told them, and faint sense of surprise that they hadn't alerted everyone on the ship of what they'd learned just through sheer volume. Didu might have fainted, he faintly remembered panicking and grabbing his friend as he toppled out of his seat. Marianne diagnosed it as shock, right? Bernadetta sobbed until she passed out, despite bearing Indeka's blood which was freely given, he'd carried her to bed. Felix threw up a few times himself, before leaping up and darting into his bunk. Seconds later he'd returned with the Aegis shield, feebly trying to shove it into Indeka's hands while repeating brokenly that the saint had far more right to it. Take it back, it belongs to you, I feel sick just looking at it, dammit, I can't use this thing. Indek had quietly responded, you'll need it for this war. If another Eridbar exists, then there are duplicates for all the others as well. Shiva would tell you to keep it and use it to protect your family. Somehow, that remark didn't seem to ease Felix's mind much. Nor Claude's, he'd probably been mere seconds behind the swordsman in doing the same. Marianne and Ash couldn't stop crying. Hilda alternated between crying and trying to avoid throwing up, since they'd already made a mess. Linhard was in shock, Yuri as well, so stunned he was speechless. How often did that happen? And Byleth, she'd been silent, tears dripping down her cheeks, staring at a faraway point as she attempted to comfort the person most distraught over these revelations, Suthi's. Why she hadn't manifested and smote all who carried the stolen blood of her children, Dmitri couldn't quite figure out. He doubted he would have that much sanity left in him after being told that story. They'd all gone to bed eventually, somehow. Not that sleep came without a price. Even though he'd shared his bed with Claude and Byleth in an attempt to comfort each other, he'd kept waking in the night, shaking and covered in sweat as the most vivid nightmares he'd had since the days immediately after the tragedy replaying themselves again and again in his mind. Eventually, when the first rays of sun had fallen through the windows, he'd given up. As if in a trance, he'd thrown on a floor-length coat, taken Eridbar from where it was leaning on the wall, and walked out to the chair he was now sitting in, watching the sun rise. The sun always came up, even after such terrible tragedy and evil was wrought. Was that a comfort or a sign of the world's indifference? I should have made sleeping tea for all of you. Indeka's soft voice drifted up behind him. Dmitri didn't turn around, hesitant to look the old yet young man in the eye even as he walked over and sat next to him with no hesitation. Was that him? He asked softly. He said I'm sorry. Was he talking to me, or to you? It defies all sense, even for me, that Michael Bladed could have been on that battlefield, Indek confessed. But when he said those words, they were the only words he ever said to me. I only met him a handful of times, the last time on the plains. I was aiming to snipe him down, I think he spotted me. Because he, one of the best fighters in Fodlan, slowed down, left a small opening in his guard. He let me shoot him. The only words he said when I went to him to take the lance were I'm sorry and Vishnu. Dmitri swallowed over bile. He knew him, and yet he still accepted. That was when I realized I'd heard of him before those terrible days, Indek mused. Vishnu had come back to the canyon, speaking fondly about two young men he'd met and spent some time with. He was fond of them, one more than the other. He'd laughed. He paused, staring wistfully at the sunrise. He hoped to bring them into the community, but he was hesitant to tell them he was a dragon because of a conversation they'd had about a rumor of Lien's death. The boys had shrugged off the story under the assumption that a dragon was just an animal, and were puzzled by his reaction to it. It shook Vishnu's confidence enough that he delayed telling them, but he ran out of time. They left that city on Nemesis's orders, and a few days later Nemesis slaughtered everyone. Indek shook his head. Not knowing whether or not Bladed or Regan had known ate away at me. Mikul and Sirios were too angry to care, Sikal was numb with despair, but it tormented me. I wanted to know, demanded he tell me, but all he would say is I'm sorry. Over and over. I only remember how broken he sounded, him, Regan, Frildarius, Lamine, they were the ones I fought, and their reactions haunt me even now. I wish I knew, if only I can finally put the last of my demons to rest. Dmitri lowered his head, staring at Eridbar. Now that he was looking for it, it really did look like it was pulsing like a heartbeat. Like the last shimmers of Vishnu's life were flaring around his bones. This lance has never been sacred. We met Maurice in the woods, he said without thinking about it. He felt like he was standing outside his own body, watching someone else talk. I thought he was regretful for the lives he took in his rampages, for trusting Agartha. But all of this. No one has been able to give him rest. Indek reached over and brushed a stray strand of hair out of his eyes. He hadn't done it up like he was now used to doing, he'd been too distracted. Even that small, kind gesture threatened to throw Dmitri into a flood of tears. I guess that's inevitable, without Mother or the sword created from her. He offered to help us storm Shambhala. Swore he'd do it if Byleth would give him release. Oh, Sirios and Mikul will hate that, Indek laughed wetly. Well, they'll just have to bloody well live with it. There's no point in forcing him to suffer anymore, he's been suffering for 1,000 years. What does punishing a remorseful man trapped in a monster for so long do? I'm amazed you can say that. Dmitri shut his eyes. If I had suffered as you suffered, I would want to kill them all. How can you bear to let me use these bones as a weapon? Continue to treat what remains of your brother as nothing but a tool. You have suffered as I've suffered, Dmitri Alexander Blade did. We both saw our families slaughtered, helpless to do a thing. Indek responded quietly. I wish nothing for you but a good life after the nightmare you've suffered thanks to Agartha. If doing so means you must use Vishnu's bones, I can live with that. He placed a hand on top of Dmitri's. I've had a lot of time to grieve, much longer than you. Hating those people only served as a constant reminder of the pain I felt over my loss. It was like holding burning coals in my bare hands. I had to let go if I wanted to feel any peace. And the more I grieved, the more I risked losing all my happy memories of my family in the haze of their deaths. You remember good times you spent with your father. That's, the first time he'd truly recalled one had been that dinner, right before he truly met Claude, wasn't it? He remembered the moment his father died. Suthies knew it had played itself out in his mind many times, but the years of happiness, had he truly let his grief drown them all out? Grief isn't something you can put on a timetable, Indek murmured, once again giving him a kind smile. I hope you'll find, as time goes on, that it drifts to the bottom of your heart, no longer causing you so much pain as it used to, or dimming the joys of your life now. It's that obvious? He asked, managing a weak returning grin. You're a kind man, and too earnest to hide your feelings well, Indek chuckled. It's good that my little sister has you and Claude in her life. You won't ever forget every imperfect part of her that makes up who she is. He glanced out at the ocean again, which was gently causing the boat to bob up and down on its waves. It's enough for me that Maurice feels regret, remorse. As to the state Michael's in, whatever horror the Agarthans have wrought to raise him from his grave, it's hideous. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, including him and the other elites. They should be put to rest, and if they truly didn't know where the blood and bones of their weapons came from, perhaps I'll be able to let go of my anger towards them too. His lip twitched. McCule always said I was too quick to forgive, but I've never felt the need to change that. Dmitri looked out at the clouds, painted yellow, orange and red by the slowly rising sun. Atra found her conscience in the middle of the tragedy that killed my father and all but one of my friends. She didn't directly kill anyone, but the poison she spread out made it easy. She's half mad with guilt and grief. I told myself I'd never forgive her, but the notion keeps following me. She saved Glenn. She's helped us in so many ways, willing to risk her life without batting an eye to make Agartha's defeat possible. I feel confused about her. I can't decide what to do or how to feel. Am I truly not betraying anyone who died that day by considering forgiving her? You can forgive her without forgetting what she did, Indek said. And remember, forgiving her won't just affect her, but you as well. Absolution can lift some of your burdens, as it did for me. I won't tell you what to do or how to feel. But think about what I said, and remember how it might help you, as well. I will. Dmitri promised. Somehow, a knot in his chest seemed to loosen. Thank you, Saint Indek. You don't have to call me that, you know. I think it's what you deserve to be called. He hesitated. Why did Saint Sirios tell the stories that she did? I can't fathom trying to do the same, even to spare children from carrying such a bloody legacy. Indeka's lip twitched. You can ask her and Sikal when we get back to port. I think Rhea ought to start telling the truth, all things considered. Chapter 68. Claude gazed at the ceiling, his stomach rolling at the waves rocking the boat and the thoughts bouncing around his head. It was the middle of the night, so dark he couldn't see anything other than the dim white light of the torch stone on his desk, but it wasn't the shadows dancing eerily on his ceiling that was keeping him awake. Nemesis slaughtered Suthies as children in order to empower the elites. I wonder why. Did he want them to live a long life, like he would thanks to the crest of flames? Did he do it as a means of cementing their loyalty to him? He wondered distantly, lightly stroking Bylitha's hair absent-mindedly. Was he just desensitized to death and killing so he didn't think anything of it, or he find it easy to kill them because he didn't think of them as human? He remembered the pain in Indeka's face as he recounted the murders of his family, the way his hands shook. It was old pain, deep and lingering. It was such a human reaction. In spite of their newly revealed dragonic nature, he understood the saints better than any scripture that called them human could have taught him. They're so close to being human, except for the wisdom over so many years, there might as well not be a difference. Yet that didn't stop the massacre. Indek said that Nemesis committed the massacre alone with the sword of the Creator. But did Ren von Regan know? He didn't seem to know much about their Agarthan allies when he was trying to help Maurice. Did he just assume? I need to find the rest of his letters. There were more in Abyss, I know it. There were other journals there, in a hidden bookcase within the large library. Atra had found them in a vault in the Eastern Church, absconding with them a year before they had met her. He longed to go back to the monastery and bury himself in books again, to put down his bow and stop fighting. To heal wounds in Fodlan and its people, rather than create them. Agartha is still, obsessed with the idea that they're the only true humans alive. They, at least most of them, Atra proved there were exceptions, could barely even conceive of Fodlan's people or the Nabateans as people, not animals. And wasn't that familiar? Mingled with the sheer horror of knowing where his crest came from, the tragedy of the canyon they had wandered through so many months ago, knowing that his bow was a bone construct of an innocent, was that deliberate, ignorant malice that had dogged him all his life. Wasn't that funny? That one thought that had haunted him throughout his life, the one he'd thought had been put to rest by Suthes, by Byleth, and Dimitri, rose out of its grave. Are we truly incapable of accepting others different from ourselves? Dimitri nuzzled into his shoulder, whimpering softly. Claude shifted as best he could without dislodging Byleth on his right and peppered soft kisses on his forehead, humming softly. Dimitri's eyelids fluttered briefly, but he sank deeper into the mattress and drifted off into a less fitful sleep. He smiled, despite the anxiety kindling in his chest. Will Fodlan still reject me after everything when they find out who I am? Byleth murmured Khalid in her sleep. He glanced over at her. Her dreams weren't showing on her face, but her arm slid up his chest, her fingers brushing against Dimitri's shoulder. She nuzzled his throat, causing his breath to hitch. The prince let his head drop back onto the pillow, drinking in their warmth and their love for him. It reminded him of Lysithea's awkward declarations that she liked and trusted him, Bernadetta's hugs and efforts to protect him in battle, Lorenz's eventual respect, Leonie's cheerful acceptance of his less-than-noble personality, Raphael's unshakable confidence in his plans and that he wouldn't let them fall, Ingat's admiration, Flane's kindness even in the face of his pestering. No. I don't believe that. Hatred isn't intrinsic, it's learned, and it can be unlearned. Someone just has to make the first step, and reach out their hand. He smiled faintly. Shiva and Selene crossed into the east to stomp out slavery there, before the cataclysm. Even after everything the cataclysm had rendered lost to history, being freed from slavery with the sword remained in Almira. Were Ash's gargoyles golems, and Ash himself a merged memory of those two children of Suthes? Claude pondered what his parents would think of that, hopefully he'd get a chance to tell them soon. Being back in Adrestia was almost a relief, and not just because it meant he was finally off the freakin' boat. Claude knew that now they had broken the Empire's hold over Brigid, solidified their control over multiple cities and routed the Imperials in every decisive battle, there was nothing more for them to do but march towards Inver. Once that city fell and Edelgard was captured, the war would be over, it was so close. Then they would choose a group to hold the country, return to Gareg Mach to meet up with the second half of the army and recover. Then they would march on Shambhala. They came back just in time to see the cleanup of an attack on Rodrigue and Judith's forces. Dimitri had been quite frightened for a few moments before his surrogate father emerged from the crowds waiting for them essentially unharmed with his usual kind smile. Yuri's network of troublemakers, who were essentially their spy network, had come through again, warning them long before the troops actually managed to reach the port and thus giving them ample time to prepare. As a result, Judith and Rodrigue drove them away without a single casualty. Leclerc, we owe your men royalties for their work, Rodrigue had remarked with that warm, honest, and charming sincerity he shared with Dimitri. I plan to give it to them after Inver falls, however much leaning on my fellow lords it requires. You're too kind, Yuri responded with a startled smile. We had not expected much. In other words, you hadn't expected the lords of Firgus or the Alliance to even acknowledge street rats and criminals had done them a service, much less praise and reimbursement for their efforts. Claude filled in silently, his lips twitching upwards into a small smile. Fortunately, we're working with different men than the type that you're used to. They've given us a pretty good idea of what's going on across the continent. Judith added. Except for some forces here and there, most of the remaining Imperial troops are retreating to Inver to reinforce the capital. Unrest is bubbling up in the cities, the Emperor jacked up the taxes in order to arm and recruit for her army, farmers and tradesmen are feeling it the most and fearing for their fields as we continue to march. With the losses mounting, it's not hard to see riots in the near future, assuming they haven't already broken out. Byleth's face fell at that. The civilians, they would die in droves if they attempted any sort of uprising, even with the imperial army such a weakened state. She squared her shoulders. No more. We must march for Inver and put an end to this pointless conflict. Hopefully we'll be able to take care of some Agarthan commanders as well, should any of them be in charge. You have the right of it, my child. Rhea, Sirios said with a low urgency mingled with the ferocious anger she'd wielded like a sword from the moment Edelgard's mask broke in the holy tomb. Judging by the way Seath, Sikal, and Indek glanced worriedly at her, he wasn't the only person who found it disturbing/off-putting. We cannot wait for them to recover from the last battle, it will only make the war drag on. Let's pull a map out, Dmitri urged. I believe there's a quick way to Inver if we pass by Hyrm. And so they had spent several hours standing around a table in a restaurant, debating, planning, and eventually deciding on a route of transport. Then they'd had to do inventory, just as he'd predicted. Rodrigue, Judith and Seath, Sikal, what the hell he'd been living with this man for how long had found/procured supplies to go with Petra's gifts, not just food and water but weapons and metal to repair them with as well. They would have to wait another half day in the port city in order to give the blacksmiths time to repair and forge new weapons. Given the pileup of cracked and broken weapons the army had been dealing with, it was a necessary time sink. However, once that was taken care of, they would march to Inver. It felt strange in Claude's mind. He knew intellectually that a few months was a short war, especially a war that involved the whole of the continent, was a borderline miracle. Lug's rebellion had lasted 4 years. The Alliance's succession took 2. Yet somehow it felt to him like they had been at war for ages. The months of his school days felt very far away indeed. He was exhausted by it, not helped by knowing that after they seized the capital, they would return to Garag Mach to meet up with the northern forces, and planned their siege on Shambhala. This war is a waste, a farce, he thought bitterly at one point, while Dmitri politely argued with Rhea, Sirios she wrote the scriptures she created all of it, about how quickly they should march. He wondered if it showed on his face, because Judith shot him briefly concerned looks. This is a waste of innocent lives, and only the Agarthans are winning anything from this. What the fuck were you thinking, Edelgard? Would he get an answer out of her if he confronted her at the gates of Inver, or if they managed to capture her alive? And frankly, did anything she say even matter after she started a war that claimed a massive number of lives despite its short length? To say nothing of her accepting Agartha's help for her little land grab. No. They weren't all made from mother's bones. Claude shook his head in an attempt to clear it, his stomach twisting unpleasantly at the memory of Indeka's grief-stricken words. Touching Fail not just before he and the others disembarked from the ship gave him chills, he still felt cold and sick when he had it slung over his shoulders. Bones. He'd been a little disturbed when he first saw it, being reminded of a mural of ashes burning form as he descended into madness. Had they seen Lien, that little boy, younger than Lysathea, get hit with javelins of light and what it did to him? Conflated that with faint memories of Shiva and Selene. But if you'd given him 100 years, he never would have guessed the hero's relic, twisted origins. He glanced at Rhea, Sirios, accepted Dimitri's reasoning for a slower march than she'd demanded and returned her attention to Byleth. Now the affectionate and hopeful way she'd always looked at his queen made perfect sense. She'd placed her heart in Byleth's body when she was a baby. She probably thought Byleth was Suthi's, at least at first. Did Seath/Sikal know? No, that didn't really make sense. He'd been wary of her at first. He would ask after they finished up here. Atra, how much value do you think Thales puts on Inver, or Adrestia as a whole? Rodrigue asked, glancing at the young renegade. She'd looked solemn and a little worried throughout the meeting, biting her bottom lip whenever the Imperial retreat was mentioned. He only needs it as a convenient tool to weaken the rest of Fodlan. Even if she had managed to complete her conquest, he would have disposed of her along with her most loyal and dropped Adrestia into power vacuum anarchy. Atra responded bluntly and succinctly. If we reach Inver with the people rising in revolt, he'll leave a few tools to do as much damage to us as possible and abandon the Emperor to her fate. She tilted her head a bit and brow furrowed. Unfortunately that means there's little chance of us to kill him before he flees back to Shambhala. Losing him would be a significant blow to their organization, since only he and his council have ever shared power. A few tools, so you suspect there will be tidiness in Inver? Judith asked sourly, remembering the description she'd given them before they set out. They'd been fortunate in that they'd yet to see any of the metal monsters yet, but that just served as a sour reminder that storming Shambhala was going to be a nightmare. Even with Morris's help. He really did need to help Indek brace for running into him again, repentant or not. Most likely, I can't imagine the Emperor hasn't demanded further reinforcement after the mounting number of losses she's faced. Rhea's expression darkened. We'll have to prepare for them as best we can, Seath noted. I recall you saying that the relics could reliably damage them. I'm assuming a bit when I say that, but I think so, Atra said grimly. But even then, they'll be hard to destroy. It may require up to 3 of them just to take one down thanks to the sheer size of them. Size is a problem, huh? Claude hummed, both to ease his nerves and refocus himself. I'll talk to Lawrence and see if he's willing to let Lysithea borrow Thyrsus again. I think between me, her and Constance, we can bring the metal giants down. He spoke with a confidence he didn't really feel, but seeing Atra perk up a bit did him good. Well, now that we have a plan, we should get the army prepared to march. Letters from the north will hopefully be arriving soon as well. I doubt Burgles has been able to get far, but I do worry. Rodrigue said the second part mostly to himself, but it got a general noise of agreement. As they left the restaurant for the last time, Claude saw a flash of pink out of the corner of his eye. Hey, Hilda, he said, letting the others go ahead as his friend ran up to him and skidded to a halt, panting. She had a letter in one hand. Where's the fire? Ugh, that is so not funny right now, Hilda grumbled, straightening up. She gave him an extremely indigent look, opening the envelope and revealing there are 2 letters inside. You owe me a story, mister, and I'm too excited to wait. She slapped the second one into his hands. From Holst, for your eyes only. And professors, since I'm assuming you're too sweet on her to hide this little tidbit. His heart hammering, that could mean a couple of things, but the way she said that. Claude rapidly glanced from side to side, seeing no one but civilians, and leaned back against the stone wall. For my eyes only, and you read it anyway? I don't know what I expected. The teasing could barely make its way out of his throat around the rock in the middle of it. Hands shaking with trepidation, he opened the letter and took in its contents. Lord Claude Regan, Prince Khalid. You're the maddest lord to ever grace Fodlan's landscape, and you owe me a pint. I had a bloody heart attack when Nader the Undefeated came over the ridge with hundreds of Almiran wyvern riders and horse archers, right when we were pushed back by Burgles, who was a few hours from seizing Lord Frildarius's lands, only for him to swoop right past us and crumble the Imperial front line like so much tin. I don't entirely blame you, your grandfather's letter didn't reach us ahead of them, and he explained that they were allies. Also, I do like you, which is why this letter is abbreviated to remove all the confused swearing I'd let out before your mother invited me to drink and talk with herself and Nader. She's as beautiful and deadly as I remember. Tell Balthus I can hear him laughing at me, so he should stuff it because he has no room to talk, personally shooting down Burgles when he was rallying his men to reform against the new arrival. As I'm writing this, she's drinking Lord Gautier and Karen under the table and mocking Count Rowe, who's chained up to await King Bladed's judgment for helping Burgles' invasion. Did you know he kidnapped his lady wife from her village after his knight killed her father, all because he assumed she bore a crest? Lord Gautier is giving her shelter right now, she doesn't quite believe she's free yet. I gave her your letters to me so she knows your progress, she's informed me that she's both very proud and very cross. I would brace for impact, if I were you. Nader is surprisingly fun to drink with, considering he nearly took my head off with an axe a few years back. Fighting side by side with him rather than against him was an experience and a half. I'm glad of it, to be honest. His men are making themselves right at home, the Knights of Faergus are quickly finding common ground with sharing war stories both old and new. What confusion and animosity she showed to the sudden force of foreigners melted away as soon as the tales started coming out. It was fascinating to watch. Being told that Lady Diana is now Queen of Almira, and you the Prince, turned my world upside down for a minute. Then I wasn't sure whether to laugh or sputter. You're a far braver man than I am, my friend, returning to your second home the way you did in hopes of uniting them. Fodlan's most unlikely hero, I'm already hearing songs in the streets calling you that. Faergus is fond of you. The other lords will be more uneasy, Gloucester will blow his top, but I'm sure you're expecting that. With the sheer weight of everything you've done in the war so far, forging the alliance with Fairgus, serving as Lady Eisner's chief tactician and pulling off the most unlikely victories, you have visibility and popularity others like you have never enjoyed before. This is a gamble, but I think it's one that will pay off for you. Please write back soon and tell me your plans. I want to know what you've been hoping and intending since you set foot in Fodlan. Holst. Claude read the letter over and over, hands still shivering, wondering why his vision was blurring. Hilda was hovering at his side, saying his name in concern while placing a hand on his shoulder. Then, quite suddenly, he burst out laughing, bright and open and happier than it had ever been except for the night when he, Byleth, and Dmitri confessed their love for each other. He accepted me. He isn't revolted or furious or feeling betrayed, he admires me. It isn't a breaking point that I'm half Almiran, the son of the king. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Fairgus welcomed Nader and my mother, they're fond of me, calling me a hero, they accepted me. It doesn't matter. Claude folded the letter as tears began to drip from his eyes, fearing he'd ruin the ink, and pressed it against his chest as he laughed and cried. Hilda quickly guided him into the alley, away from prying eyes while waving off some concerned commoners nearby. He was shaking badly, he hadn't lost his cool in public like this since he was a child, but he couldn't help himself. Joy and vindication were whirling inside him, fighting with a deep relief and amazement. This made everything he'd suffered through, everything he'd repressed and every risk he took worth it. It had paid off. He had been right, that once people had a chance to know each other, they would open their minds to each other. Sure, likely Nader's sweeping rescue of the Northern Army influenced the positive reaction to an extent, but this was Fairgus, so deeply suspicious of foreigners since their previous king's brutal murder and the slaughter of family, friends. Yet they still welcomed Almira when they came to their aid. This wasn't a total victory, he still had to win over the alliance and to a lesser extent the civilians of Adrestia after the war was won. But it was a victory, the one he'd feared was impossible even after Dmitri, then Byleth, accepted his true self. Claude? Hey, Claude, Hilda's voice broke into his thoughts after a minute. Claude felt her fingers gently brush his tears away, he blinked rapidly to clear his eyes and scrambled to control his breathing. Long practice made it easy, thankfully. Slowly he calmed down enough to talk and smiled brightly at her through the remains of his tears. It's nothing, he managed, carefully folding the letter again and slipping it into an inner jacket pocket. I'm really glad a gamble paid off. That's all. Hilda responded, clearly not believing that for a second. Then she grabbed him in a bear hug, her semi-enhanced strength from Dagon's blood knocking the air out of his lungs again leaving him wheezing. Dummy, she sniffed after a second, her own voice a little wobbly. You're such a dummy. How can such a smart person be so dumb? Did you really think I was going to stop being your friend because of something like this? After we've bled together, played together, protected each other's backs. What kind of person do you take me for, you prat? I was afraid to find out, Claude gasped, tapping her shoulder slightly frantically. She softened her grip a bit but didn't let go. I've been burned, so many times. I cared so much about you and the others, I was afraid of losing it all, I couldn't bear the thought, he admitted honestly, his breath hitching as tears threatened to break loose again. Dummy, Hilda repeated, hugging him tight. You're a dummy. I'm not going anywhere. You're still my best friend besides Balthus. You think Marianne will reject you? She cares too much about you two. You really think Bernie will care? She loves you, she practically worships you. Lysithea? She thinks everyone is equally dumb, so what difference does it make if you're half Almiran? Raphael loves everyone, Ignatz looks up to you, Lorne has finally unbent and admit that he respects you, Flane is Cethline. Saint Cethline, the compassionate. This is your home too, dummy, and we are your people. We're not sending you anywhere except at our head to lead us to victory. Claude let out a shaky little laugh, finally collecting himself enough to return the hug. Thanks, Hilda. That means a lot to me. They stayed there for a few moments, giving him time to recompose himself, before they left to catch up with the others. With the letter and its revelations, Claude wasn't as bent on dragging answers out of Rhea/Sirius at the moment. In fact, he was willing to wait until they had the war against Adrestia taken care of. The metaphorical dragon wasn't sitting so heavily on his back. Now his mind was clear and he could throw the whole of his concentration on the march and plans to take Hyrm. Byleth had squealed in delight when he showed her the letter, tackling and hugging him intensely, peppering his face with kisses. Dimitri had been alarmed to hear about the trouble in his homeland, but was utterly grateful for the support from Almira and very happy to hear about the aftermath. "I can't believe Mother came here," Claude admitted with a shaky laugh. "I can't believe it, she said she'd never come back to Fodlan, but she did, and leading Nader and his men to boot. I'm in so much trouble but it's worth it." "I'm looking forward to meeting her," Dimitri confessed, smiling. "You make her sound so fierce." "Oh, you don't know the half of it. She's called the Demon Queen for a reason." They left the port the next morning, heading through the cities toward Hrym. The army was in high spirits, with one of their end goals in sight. There was laughing and singing as they made their way down the winding roads of the heavily populated cities. What was amazing was the reaction of some of the Adrestian population to their approach. Some of the towns they came to were rioting, farmers and tradesmen throwing stones and mud at the imperial soldiers, at least, the soldiers who hadn't dropped their weapons to watch the scene unfold with complete apathy. When they entered the town, however, those commoners dropped their improvised weapons to surge around Byleth, Dimitri, and him as well, cheering loudly and begging them to root out the alchemist's kidnappers to save their children. Claude led a squad through the city, using his memory of maneuvering in the Alliance to root out bolt holes and attics various Agarthans would hide in. Atra was with him. She would smack the hilt of one of her swords over the shoulders of the disturbingly young mages hidden there. One of them who attempted to cast fire on him couldn't be more than 13 at most, and drag them out, all while chewing them out in their native language. The child mage squawked and flailed desperately only to abruptly stall when she caught sight of the older girl's face. "Wait, you're one of us." "I'm no soldier of Shambhala," Atra responded dryly. But they know." The child mage swung over to stare at Claude and a frowning Leonie. "But they're savages who would strip the flesh from our bones and cook it and use our bones for dream catchers or other occult knickknacks. It's a note of how disturbed I am to find a on-field mage younger than Lysithea that I'm only mildly appalled at being accused of cannibalism," Claude said dryly. The child mage froze up under his gaze, her expression trembling, wavering between defiance and fear. "Emil's been very calm with Mercedes's frequent visits. She can sit in the wagon containing him, far enough away that he can't grab her just in case he has a flare-up. I'll leave trying to ease her mind to you, Atra." The renegade gave him a small smile. "Thank you, Claude." Besides that, there was little resistance. Just as Yuri's people reported, Edelgard was pulling large chunks of her army back to secure in Bear. However, they hadn't heard from the birds for a little while. Claude wouldn't have noticed. They were good at staying hidden, if he hadn't caught Yuri's faintly worried look as he took note of it. "They know how to go underground," he heard Yuri murmur to himself during a march. Yet he still smiled when Atra twisted to give him a look of friendly concern. How close are those two at this point? Claude wondered as Yuri teased the black-haired girl. Ivory snorted as if amused by the byplay. Both Balthus and Happy were shooting their fearless leader smirks whenever his back was turned. Should I point Hilda at them? A thought for later. They were about half a day from Hrym on a leisurely march when it happened. Claude was ruffling Bernadetta's hair and trying to nudge her toward Felix, her ever-present shadow, when he spotted a moving mass headed down the road towards them. "Teach, are those soldiers or civilians?" he asked, frowning and squinting a bit. Byleth started out of her dozing state leaning against Dimitri's chest as he guided the horse onward. She leaned forward, her eyesight greatly enhanced by Suthi's heart. She stared for half a second before gasping, sliding down off the horse and bolting forward in a blur toward the approaching group. Dimitri swore. He'd been doing a lot more of that since the war started, and urged his horse into a cant after her. Bernadetta scrambled up the back of her horse, Felix joining her, and chased after him as Claude accepted Flane's reaching hand and swung her onto Ivory's back before taking off after them himself. It only took a few precious seconds to reach them, but he hissed when he saw what Byleth had seen. His beautiful queen was kneeling, hands held out over a child who was bleeding from a terrible head wound as she cast recover. Kneeling in front of her was a woman who was probably the child's mother, filthy and battered and bleeding from badly bandaged scars herself. Milling around them were a number of other farmers or market vendor merchants, some leaning heavily on others to be able to walk with scarred or straight-up missing legs. They looked like they'd just stumbled out of a war zone, but the army was still making its way to Hyrm. "Oh my!" Flame cried, sliding off Ivory's back as she floated to the ground and rushing to the group. "Please, everyone hold still, help is here." She held out her hands, humming as the soft magic of the Sethline crest, no, her inherent powers as Suthisa's granddaughter, spilled out across the battered civilians, engulfing them and healing their wounds. A ragged, relieved cheer rang out from the civilians as Byleth stood up. "What happened to you?" Dimitri asked, sliding down from his horse and checking on the child, who'd crawled into his mother's arms. The woman smiled weakly at him, shimmering with happiness at the attention he was giving her. "Have the riots begun in Hrym as well?" "And no. It was that man." The woman was shaking with fear and hatred as Bernadetta came to a halt, Felix sliding down while she watched the road for any sign of pursuers. That monster of a noble." She spat on the ground, her shoulders shaking. "Edelgard the Magnificent, Edelgard the liar. She lies with every breath she takes, claiming to be our liberator, then unleashing that man on us." Who is it?" Byleth asked tensely. "She imprisoned him for not initially supporting her," one of the other farmer rasped. "But after you crossed over to the port, she let him out of jail in exchange for his loyalty, and to quell the discontent. And the man is a murderer. He slaughters anyone who's protesting the war or the horrific taxes we've been put under. I wouldn't have the money to buy food for the winter at this rate, without any mercy. He's been going from city to city, leaving corpses in his wake." "Maximus Varley." The old woman spat out, even as she trembled with fear on the name. "He's the liar's new hatchet man." Bernadetta let out a strangled, choked squeak. Varley," she repeated in a tiny voice, sliding off her horse back and dropping the reins in shock. Felix grabbed them, turning toward her with a confused frown. "Why, you're sure?" Another farmer, a young boy, nodded sharply. "We knew he was coming our way," he said tensely. "After the first 4 cities he hit, people started running. They came to us and warned us. We knew what was coming. We tried to leave Adrestia before, only for Ionius the Weak to massacre our ruling family and gave rulership over to that pig Agir. How Lord Ferdinand is that gluttonous wretch's son, I couldn't tell you, and we'd already thrown out the last tax collectors. Lord Ferdinand went after Varley, tried to stop him from killing the rioters." Another woman shook her head violently, wrapping her arms around herself. "When Varley reached the city gates, he told us to open up or be destroyed. Lord Ferdinand interceded, swearing that those who laid down their arms and surrendered would not be harmed. Varley, he struck him with the butt end of his lance and called him a traitor. Then he ordered an attack on the gates. The city is rioting, but we've only got some deserters and compassionate folks to serve as a defense while Varley has his own men. With his daughter missing, they're obligated to serve him. He'll slaughter us." The mother handed her dazed child to the old woman and bowed her head to the dirt, her hands raised up to Byleth in supplication. "Please, Lady Eisner, have pity on us. Stop him. We know we're your enemies," the farmer pleaded, lowering his head as well. "We've never borne any ill will or resentment toward the church. Your priests have kept our children healthy for centuries. Please, help us. Drive Varley out. Hrym is at your command. Ask whatever you want of us, we're at your mercy." "Help," the child repeated, looking blearily up at them. "Say no more," Byleth said firmly, taking the mother by the shoulders and raising her up to her feet. Claude smirked grimly at the look on her face. He hadn't seen her that furious except for the Remire incident and moments during Indeka's history lesson. "I need no incentives to protect you, you are all my people. Dimitri, please go back and tell the army to step up the pace. I want to be at Hrym in half the time." Dimitri nodded, pausing to ruffle the boy's hair reassuringly before standing and remounting his horse. "Burn?" Claude asked, stepping around the cheering civilians to where his little sister was standing. When he saw her face, worry snapped over his disgust, alarm, and determination. Bernadetta was shaking harder than branches in a hurricane, her eyes wide, blank, and staring unseeingly at some point in the distance. Tears streaked down her cheeks as her mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. "Bern," he repeated worriedly, grabbing her hand and trying to turn her toward him. She stumbled. Abruptly, her legs gave out from underneath her and she collapsed onto them, a choked sob of horror leaving her throat. Cursing, Claude dropped to his knees next to her and grabbed her shoulders, trying to shake her out of her shock. "Bern, look at me. He is never going to touch you. I swear, he won't get within a dozen yards of you. I'll force-feed him his own heart if he tries anything. You aren't in the attic, Bern, you're here with us. You're here, you're strong, you're stronger than a lot of people I've met in my life. Look at me, please." "What's wrong?" Felix blurted out, shoving Nico's reins into Flane's hands and dropping to his knees next to Bernadetta. He gently grasped her chin and tilted her head so she was looking at him, concern softening his usually steely eyes. Is she having a seizure?" "Panic attack," Claude corrected, forcing down some bitter swear words because he knew Bernadetta was afraid of Felix in particular seeing her like this. "Because of her father?" Felix asked. Bernadetta let out another choked-off sob that sounded like she was running out of air. Panic flashed across the swordsman's face and he grabbed her hand. "Damn it, don't listen to my breathing, hey. Can you hear me?" "I can't," Bernadetta whimpered, her tears flowing faster. The villagers crowded around them in concern. I can't. He truly is a monster," the mother said in wonder. "She's terrified of him, his own daughter." That made Felix's eyes widen. "From what little she's told me, getting tied to a chair and imprisoned a pitch-black attic was his idea of teaching social graces." Claude spat out, rubbing Bernadetta's back. "That started before he almost murdered her best friend and forced her to watch him do it so she wouldn't disgrace the family by slumming with commoners." "What?" Felix exploded. Rage flooded his face, his knuckles turning white as he pulled Bernadetta against his chest protectively. She squeaked in surprise, blinking slowly and hesitantly looking up at his face. "Yeah. Somehow I'm not surprised to discover he's murdering his way through his lessers on his way to getting power again," Claude seethed, continuing to rub Bernadetta's back. "Bern, you trust us, right?" After a few seconds, she nodded timidly. "We're not going to let him get anywhere near you." "The hell he will. I'm going to kill him." Felix snarled, picking up Bernadetta in his arms and carrying her. She blinked through her flood of tears, staring up at him with a little hope mingled in with all the fear and distress she was radiating. Claude snorted. "If we just kill him, it's over in an instant." Felix started to bristle, then tilted his head, harsh blue eyes examining him critically. "Then what do you suggest we do instead?" he asked coolly. "First, we're going to secure the civilians and keep them from getting massacred," Claude responded, standing up and scratching the back of Ivory's neck. She was snarling and clawing at the ground, sensing his mood and smelling blood in the air. The villagers eyed her with both nervousness and awe. "Then, we are going to take everything away from that man." A few hours later, Claude was sweeping over the burning city of Hrym, flanked by Constance, Lysithea, Seath, and Hannah. Bernadetta had recovered with Felix staying with her on her horse and Yuri coming to her side. She'd swore that she was ready to fight, which impressed him mightily. The united army was crashing into the city through the back gates, opened for them by the villagers and their deserter allies. Byleth led the way inside, a cheer erupting all over the place as the instantly recognizable sword of the Creator flew across the roads and cut through two Empire soldiers before they could skewer a farmer they'd thrown to the ground. Hrym was a scene straight out of the Eternal Flames, or Ash, Shiva and Selene's seventh hell. Large chunks of the city were on fire, and the streets were clogged with rioting civilians and the Emperor's men, who were cutting down everyone in the streets whether they were armed or not. There weren't any demonic beasts, but there didn't need to be. The people's resistance could only scrape together what was in their own armories for defense, and with the siege taken out of the equation by Varley forcing the gates open. The worst part was turning a corner again and seeing Empire soldiers cutting down civilians like so much wheat. Claude, with a calm you only felt when you reached the far side of fury, summoned Fallen Star's magic and fired an arrow. The golden projectile flew down in the blink of an eye, slamming through the mounted knight who was about to spear a woman, and proceeded to whip around the open square, hitting 2, 12, 19 men, dropping them all in a couple of seconds. No prisoners here. Just retribution for the nightmarish slaughter. They'd gone out of their way to avoid civilians as best they could after invading Adrestia. Even when Dmitri had to lead his forces into a town or a city, he usually sent Yuri or a small contingent to push the citizens back into their homes while leading the soldiers into the square or out into the field in front of the gates. There hadn't been any scenes like this so far. Maybe it had been naive of him to hope they could avoid them altogether, but still. That didn't mean they were going to let it go unanswered. Lysithea pointed Thyrsis down the road and fired Hades Omega. Claude might have winced in sympathy for her human targets if he wasn't watching Hannah swoop down and check on the woman, who was sitting stunned surrounded by dead bodies and her injuries' neighbors. A moment later, Yuri appeared in a flash with Flame, gave her just long enough to cast Fortify, and then teleported away with her again. Grimacing, Claude pulled on Ivory's reins and hurtled across the city again, looking for another group of targets. Ferdinand, Constance whimpered, her voice nearly carried away by the winds and the fire and the screaming. He heard it anyway. Ferdinand, where are you? She snapped her fingers, bolting crashed down onto a road, and seconds later a loud cheer went up. There's a square full of civilians straight ahead, Seath told Claude, momentarily holstering the spear of Assel to grab a short spear. Varley troops are surrounding them. We'll see about that, Claude snarled and dug his left foot into Ivory's flank, banking a hard right so he would fly in a circle around the buildings Seath indicated. The tight streets of what was almost a city-state were harder to perceive from the air than the less cluttered town counterparts, but he found them nonetheless, civilians scattered in small groups, scrambling into each other as they tried to back away from a slowly approaching Varley front line. Were they just obeying Maximus because they had to? He couldn't be sure, of course, but the thought was sitting at the back of his mind. That didn't mean he was going to take it easy on them. He shot his next arrow at the ground a foot away from the front line. The impact cratered the cobblestone and caused a shockwave that sent dozens of rank-and-file soldiers flying in every direction. Seath flew past him and expertly threw the short spear so it pierced through the back of the sub-commander, leaving those who hadn't been thrown off their feet without direction. The final nail in the coffin was both Lysithea and Constance flying down, unleashing a flurry of Sagitt and Nosferatu on them. The ranks broke under the pounding, and the men scattered in their retreat. Smirking, Claude wheeled Ivory around, arrows whisking uselessly around him as he fired back at the snipers trying desperately to take them out. Between two Aurora shields and Constance and Seath's expert flying skills, they'd avoided any debilitating injuries to their mounts so far. Now, where are you, Maximus? They were steadily carving their way across the southwest of the city, down toward the former HRYM family residence that now had served as Agir's vacation house up until Edelgard threw him in prison. So far they were mostly securing safe zones for the civilians, which Geralt's mercenaries were manning with the help of the Knights of Sirios under Seath/Sikal, and blasting apart every formation they flew over. No sign of Maximus Varley yet, nor Ferdinand, who had gone into the city in a frantic attempt to restore order and move civilians somewhere safe. One of his loyal men, who had been protecting a couple farmers when they came across him, told them this and promptly admitted they'd lost track of him a while ago. Finding their former classmate in the middle of this nightmare was going to be a problem. A huge problem, but Claude was keeping it a somewhat present thought in his mind, shelved neatly between his need to save the civilians and find one certain bastard, that was not a technical term this time, within this burning city. Claude, civilians in a corner up and to the left, Lysithea reported, Thyrsis, Anubis's, vision-granting ability allowing her to see it. They've got maybe 30 seconds before they get slaughtered. Cuso, Claude spat. Ivory roared and lunged forward, crossing the distance in precious seconds while he reached for Fallen Star's magic again. 15 seconds to reach them, 5 seconds to aim, 2 seconds for the arrow to cross the air and do its magic. The lance-wielding knight dropped like a stone mere inches from the stone-wielding 12-year-old, who gaped in awe as the arrow whisked all around the back road, piercing arms, shoulders, legs and the occasional chest. The kid looked around in confusion before he heard his injured mother, who he'd been determined to protect, gasped loudly. He saw her looking up and followed her gaze, right up to the magnificent white wyvern circling overhead, its rider holding a gleaming bow. The boy dropped the stone, awed, staring up at the figure. Claude was oblivious to this, grabbing a torch and firing it up in the air to signal medical. Rob and Hannah had secured travel roads, someone would be with them soon, hopefully soon enough for the people moving slowly on the ground. Then he kept moving, another bolting from Constance drawing him to another group of trapped commoners. Seeing the dead bodies, even briefly as he flew over the streets, was sickening. It tore at his heart. They were butchered, and by their own army. He wondered if Edelgard was desperate to let Maximus Varley out in the hopes of restoring order. She probably feared being ousted from power the way her father was. Maybe she was right to be afraid, since all her siblings disappeared after the insurrection. But he also decided he didn't care. Her reasoning, her hopes, her grand ideals, none of them mattered. This was a horror that surpassed even turning street kids over to Solon and his cronies to make demonic beasts. She had lost any right to call herself emperor after unleashing monsters on her own people. Whether she lived or died, he was going to tear her off that throne if it was the last thing he did. These people didn't deserve this. They only wanted to have the choice to not throw their lives away for a cause they didn't believe in. Faster! Faster! He flew over another city corner, firing Fallen Star and watching the men drop like so many flies. I'm going to throw up a lot when I come down from my battle rage, he mused distantly. He wasn't killing everyone he launched Fallen Star at, just almost everyone. He wasn't putting nearly as much effort as he usually did to fight non-lethally, to take prisoners or just let injuries enemies drop to the ground. Lysithea, for once not doing quite as much damage as he was, couldn't be avoided. Her attacks were powerful and intense and would destroy buildings, along with a huge risk of hitting the commoners they wanted to save, but that hardly meant she wasn't pulling her weight. She'd somehow found the time during the marches to learn warp, and was helping Flane, Marianne, Linhard, Mercedes, and Dorothea move all over the city as needed, and that's when she wasn't pulverizing particularly stubborn foes with Hades Omega or Abraxas. Constance was providing irreplaceable pressure with bolting, as always, while Seath and Hannah dealt with anyone they missed along the way. Where in the blazing flames are you hiding, Maximus? That was Claude's problem right now. He was almost certain that if they could just get that man, the army would fall apart without fear or his bullish personality driving them onward. Of course, trying to find one person in this mess was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Unless you happened to spot their standard in the distance. With all the smoke, that was a bit of an accomplishment, but Claude managed it. Found him, settle this for me, okay? He said vaguely before darting off. Seeing as no one called after him, they must have realized who he was. Lysithea had expressed an interest in kicking Varley in the face a few times after he went down. Claude was pleased by the mental image. He and Ivory flew through a smoke cloud and surfaced overhead as Felix Frildarius sliced through the straps of Maximus Varley's saddle, grabbed him by the arm with his free hand and violently yanked him off his mount. The man crashed to the ground, swiping wildly at his younger enemy. Felix nimbly jumped out of the way. Claude circled overhead, shooting down a sniper who had tried to take aim at Felix from behind some rubble. Maximus stood up, raising a massive broadsword and pointing it at the young man, his whole posture incredulous. He wore black armor from head to toe, likely chose the color for intimidation, splattered with blood and gore. He couldn't tell from how high up he was, but he was pretty sure he also saw chips, breaks and dents in that armor. Were you keeping up with him while he was on a horse, Felix? Someone's motivated. Who the fuck are you? He demanded. Who dares lay a hand on account of Adrestia, the one true kingdom of Fodlan? Tisk, Felix snorted. He pulled the Aegis shield, Shiva's bones, off his back and slid it into place on his arm, raising the sword of Merulta to an offensive stance. I don't waste my breath in battle. Then he was moving in a flash. Claude hummed, turning over Ivory's other side and firing down at the Varley men who were rushing to support their current lord. The impact tore up the ground, forcing them to scramble backwards and stare fearfully up at him. He shot down the archers that aimed at him, providing cover for Felix as slashed Maximus's lance in half and dodged the sword swing retaliation. I wanted to do it myself, but I think Felix would be pissed if I intervened. So he focused on moving, picking off and maintaining the arena as Felix proved that he might not be quite as good as his older brother with a sword, but he was pretty damn terrifying. He was on the offensive, a whirlwind of death that pushed Maximus back, back. He had complete control over the field. Maximus was scrambling to counter. He was bigger and heavier, but between his heavy armor and how off balance he was, he just couldn't keep up with Felix as he took one sacred sword strike after another. He had a sword as well as his lance, but he wasn't putting up any pressure, just blocking wherever he could. Smirking, Claude fired off another arrow at the carefully approaching Varley troops and circled back, flying lower to the ground while still saying out of Felix's way. "That sword, that shield, you're one of the Frildarius brats," Maximus sneered, swinging and missing again as Felix nonchalantly dodged to the side. Of course a family play acting at nobility would be so crude as to take a swing at his betters. Felix snorted before ducking under his swing and stabbing the older man in the elbow. The sacred blade pierced through the armor and into the soft flesh below. To give Maximus a shred of credit, he didn't scream loudly. He took another swing aiming at knocking the sword away. Felix wrenched it loose and jumped back. "I'll take any remark coming from a man who murders his own people with all the discretion it deserves," he said contemptuously. Then he slashed at the man's back, forcing him away. "You little bradash. I had an enlightening conversation with Claude on the way here," Felix said coolly, taking a blow on the aegis, Shiva, shield and threw the man back. "I've thought a lot about what I wanted to do with you. I thought about stabbing you through the lung and watching you choke to death on your own blood. I thought about cutting off both your arms and leaving you to live the rest of your life as an invalid who can't even eat without his servants. I've thought about handing you over to Atra and telling her to do her worst, with all that implies from her upbringing in Shambhala." He slashed, snapping the man's sword in half on the impact. "When I got in here and saw the corpses of those people, on top of everything else you've done to someone I love, I thought about impaling you alive on a spike, let you writhe and slowly expire as the sun traveled across the sky," he added icily, watching Maximus's incredulous and increasingly alarmed expression. "But," he paused, then smirked. Claude thought he could see Shiva's fangs in that smile. "I'm not going to do any of those things. Bernadetta might not like them. So instead, I'm going to ensure that what happens to you is worse than any of them combined." Chapter 69. The familiar feeling of divine pulse rushed through Byleth's mind, placing her back in time a few minutes. The instant she let the magic dispel, she turned sharply to the left, climbed a broken-down stall and jumped straight up. Her hand snagged on the leg of an enemy Pegasus knight, one of the very few among Varley's wyvern riders, and was promptly yanked off her feet up into the air. Using her greatly increased strength, it had come to her rescue so many times already. Byleth avoided the Pegasus's attempts to kick her and managed to swing herself up onto the elegant creature's back. The Pegasus knight squawked in disbelief and elbowed her violently. Byleth took it on her armor and hit the back of her helmet with the hilt of the creator's sword. The Pegasus lurched down, dropping a yard before steadying as her primary rider collapsed forward, unconscious, and then slipped off the saddle so she was dangling in the air by her ankle which was tangled in the stirrup. Grabbing the reins, Byleth urged the Pegasi forward and then straight down. And jumped, her feet crashing down on the knight who had his lance raised to impale a bleeding, battered Ferdinand. The lance went flying, the man crumbled beneath the impact and Byleth tumbled down to the ground, her lungs heaving when her back hit the ground. Grunting with exertion, the 10th use of divine pulse making her ears ring faintly, Byleth rolled onto her side and cast aura across the yard from her. It blasted through a fortress knight's armor, sending him tumbling over and crushing the mage next to him below the weight of his armor. Forcing one knee under her, Byleth quickly followed the blow up with Nosferatu, aiming at the other fortress knight was still standing. A sharp scream and a rush of healing magic assured her of the impact. She grinned as she stood up, snatching the creator's sword, Suthisa's bones, off the ground and swinging it in as wide an arc as she could. The villagers, pressed against the alley's dead-end wall behind Ferdinand and the handful of his men who had managed to stick by him, burst into cheers and cries of worship. Byleth couldn't help but wince, an icy breeze rushing across her as she twisted the sword she'd been so comfortable with up until a few days ago to return it to its blade form. "Stay focused, Byleth," Suthis responded, her voice, which had been so quiet and subdued since she stepped off the boat, sounding much more like her usual snappy self. That knightly battalion is rounding the corner right now. Right, she pivoted on her foot and swung the blade, unleashing her magic through it as it cracked apart into its whip form and tore up the ground. Several horses neighed in fear, rearing up as shards of cobblestone and dirt right up in their faces. A few of them had the chance to back up before the magic hit. A familiar explosion of light and fire rocked the ground and the buildings on either side of them. Byleth twisted on her heel and took those precious handful of seconds to put one hand on Ferdinand's shoulder. The cheerful, if oblivious, and somewhat socially inept noble boy she remembered from Garreg Mach was a wreck. Blood was still leaking from the head wound Varley had inflicted on him before storming the gates. His arm guards were all but shattered and even looked like they were melted on his leathers and arms. Filth and dried blood coated his dented chest plate and shoulders. He probably had some internal injuries judging by how his breathing sounded and how he couldn't quite stand up. One of his ankles looked like it had been twisted pretty badly at one point. Really, it was amazing he was still holding his lance, much less definitively placing himself between his people and Varley's men. She'd finally managed to reach him in time. Byleth had known this fight was going to be a nightmare when she crashed through the back gates and saw the city already burning. Yet at the beginning it had seemed somewhat manageable. She'd only needed 2 uses of Divine Pulse to rescue the first few gaggles of rioting civilians who had been separated out of the squares to be slaughtered by Varley's loyal men. She'd come across men who nominally served Varley, but were unwilling to kill their own people and backed down when she or Bernadetta confronted them. Some even put their swords down at the sight of their young lady, obeying her and treating her as though she were the current reigning Lady Varley. They'd pushed deeper into the city, urging civilians who were still rioting to stand back and help their neighbors while they took control of Hrym. Ingrid was performing magnificently, using Burning Quake to remarkable effect to separate the attacking Imperials from civilians. Lewin, Typhon's Bones' unique power was that of fire and volcanic heat. When its magic was unleashed, fangs of magma not unlike the flames of Alel burst up from the earth, consuming not just anyone who hit them, but anyone who had the misfortune of standing too close immediately had skin bubble and burn horrifically. It did require that Ingrid drop down and ram Lewin's blade into the ground to unleash it, but the newly minted Falcon Knight was running on a determination that allowed her to dodge seemingly every arrow aimed at her. The massive cracks in the earth would be difficult to repair in the aftermath, but given how much of the city was already burning, Hrym would already need immense repairs after this battle ended. Byleth, using the Sublime Heaven technique to tear up the handful of beasts that were chasing after children and elders, managed to set up a system of warp and return, another spell that Atra had learned in Shambhala, and then taught to Mercedes and Annette. With Yuri, Seath and Ria's help, this allowed Flane, Mercedes, Marianne, Rodrigue, Dorothea, and the other healers to move all over the city to wherever they were needed in an instant. Dimitri was leading the charge straight into the heart of the city to force a confrontation with Maximus Varley, though perhaps it was better to say that Felix was leading it. She'd seen him talking to Glenn right before they got into the city proper. She hadn't been close enough to hear what they were saying, but she saw Glenn calmly hand his little brother the sword of Merulta in exchange for his woe-do with a small smirk. She'd been fairly composed, even as she kept stumbling over the bodies of rioting civilians who'd been butchered in the process. Then she'd turned a blind corner and found herself staring at Ferdinand's mangled corpse. He'd clearly been killed a little while ago. He'd been impaled on multiple spears, his men dead around him, and behind him were the bodies of multiple civilians, including children. The way he was positioned, the fact that he was still gripping his lance even in death, he must have kept trying to protect them even as he kept getting injured. Byleth had stared for a few seconds, looking at the bloody scene, and then she'd just felt something in her brain snap, and she activated Divine Pulse. I refuse. I'm tired of looking down at the bodies scattered all over the battlefield. I've already arrived too late to help so many people here. If he was alive when I entered this city, I will save him. Whether she'd gotten lucky, or Suthies had reacted to her declaration by warping reality for her, but she'd managed to find Ferdinand alive after just 2 divine pulses. Unfortunately, getting to him before someone else did had rapidly proven to be a sticking point. The Imperial soldiers reacted instantly to her approaching, not just her either. It looked like they recognized all her students, which was worrying, and what's more, they reacted in a way she didn't expect. Specifically, rather than turn their attention to a dangerous new threat, they put their energy into attempt to deny them what they were trying to reach. A few times she reached him just in time to see him get skewered. She would manage to take out the first man she saw reach him. Only enemies she'd only been peripherally aware of swoop in and either finish him off or giving her a serious injury in her distraction. The extent of his injuries was another problem. Her previous pulse had allowed her to defeat all the enemies, but Ferdinand had died of shock and blood loss by the time she turned to him. So she needed to think laterally, buy herself a little time to heal him up a bit, then rain fiery retribution on Varley's lackeys. "Hello, Ferdinand," Byleth said with a weak smile as she cast Recover on him. His injuries were bad enough that even one use of the spell was a stopgap for now, but it would keep him out of death's embrace. She was tempted to burst into confused, humorless laughter or start crying. She reached for the cold confidence that had once characterized her entire life in order to stay calm and alert. "Professor?" Ferdinand asked dazedly. He blinked up at her as if she was expecting her to dissolve like a mirage. "Hang on, I'll finish up here," she promised, her voice barely audible above the cheering of the civilians. Even as she said the words, she whirled back around and brought the Creator's sword, Suthisa's bones, up again as the knights made it through the dissolving light from her defensive attack. "A plan, after my scheming heart, teach," Claude had laughed after seeing her pull of an elaborate trick in battle, snapped into her mind. She promptly cast Aura directly at the anti-magic shield the lead knight was wielding. The magic struck home and, since the shield spread it out and dissolved its impact, filled the whole alley with bright light. While the enemies reeled in panic and blindness, Byleth, whose eyes weren't fazed by the brightness at all, darted forward and slashed the straps of the knight's saddle, letting him fall to the ground and be stepped on by his panicking mount. She winced in sympathy before stabbing a fortress knight through his armor, the blazing blade easily slicing through the heavy steel like hot butter. Without missing a beat, she jumped to the right to avoid a thrown lance and promptly cast Thunder. The metal armor the knight wore conducted the attack, magnifying it. He spasmed and dropped while Byleth spun to the other side and cast Thunder again, striking the sword master trying to dart past her in the arm. As he reeled from the impact, she swung the sword and let it snap out into whip form to reach and slash open the man's shoulder. He dropped to one knee, his weapon clattering to the floor, while Byleth swung the blade out in a wide half-circle, causing both horses to jump and fling their riders up into the sky to bash against the alley walls. Byleth twisted the sword, letting it clack back into blade form, looking challengingly at the line of swordsmen who were standing at the mouth of the alley, staring at her. She shrugged and waved for them to come closer. They backed right up, then dropped their weapons in surrender. Relieved, Byleth spun around and scrambled back to Ferdinand. "Hang in there for a moment, everyone. A healer will be with you in a moment," she told them as she cast Recover again. Color came back to the orange-haired boy's face as the rest of his worst wounds healed up. She lit a torch and flung it up into the air, then she helped Ferdinand to his feet. "Can you try and reassure the other civilians?" she asked, blurting out the first excuse that came to mind that wasn't, "Get off the battlefield, you'll die. We're spread out and taking care of the other rioting pockets. Varley won't last much longer. He better pray for his death in battle. If I get my hands on him, you'll turn him over to Felix and Claude because you couldn't possibly come up with a worse fate for him than they will," Suthis interjected with faint amusement. Byleth snorted. "You say that like you aren't suppressing your desire to smite him so hard the ground he stands on will bubble and smoke for the next 400 years. True," the goddess acknowledged diplomatically, a slightly malicious edge to her amusement. "But that would not make much of a lesson, would it?" "I suppose it wouldn't," she allowed. Mercedes appeared in a flash before Ferdinand could fumble out a response. Byleth decided not to give him a chance to say anything. "We'll talk afterwards, I promise," she said reassuringly before turning around and bolting. She vaguely heard him say something, but it was drowned out by the chaos still raging all around them. Stepping back into the streets, Byleth let out a huge sigh of relief. 10 turns. 10 turns and my head is still clear and I don't feel any impulse to vomit up my guts. I still have several left in me, thank goodness. She saw a silver flurry of flashes directly ahead of her, aimed down another street, and ran towards it. Bernadetta was forcing her way through a narrow alleyway that led out into a massive grassy field next to the rushing river that cut through the middle of the city-state. Indek was standing at her side, killer bow in hand, adding his own ghostly volley of duplicate arrows to hers. The War Masters were dropped like so much wheat. Sylvain rushed into the alley as soon as they let up the pressure, lance of ruin at the ready, a war cry ringing from his throat. As she caught up with them, Byleth saw what they had seen, a large horde of Imperial soldiers, these ones not wearing Varley colors but that of the Imperial court, extra troops on loan from the capital, no doubt. They weren't the only ones there, however, there was something else that made her eyes widen. It was a demonic beast, but it was nothing like the ones she'd seen so far. It was enormous, it towered over the multi-story building on its far left. It stood upright on two legs, massive four-fingered hands grabbing civilians and allied soldiers alike to send them flying, at least, those that it didn't drop into its massive jaw, which unhinged unnaturally with a sickening crackle to devour and swallow them. Standing upright as it was, it might even be bigger than Maurice, Audash. Byleth saw a flicker of light around the light, a familiar one, a horrifying soft silver-blue light that she'd seen surrounding Marianne in the thick of battle. The crest of the beast. The monster roared, shaking the whole world around them. Civilians who had previously been rioting had dropped their weapons and were rushing in a desperate attempt to escape the living nightmare the Imperial troops were pursuing. "What the fuck is that?" Ingrid demanded as she swooped down. "I think I can hear Atris wearing a blue streak," Byleth noted with an iciness that sounded like it was coming from a ways away. "Ingrid, up in the air, circle around that monstrosity and try to hold its attention, we'll protect you from arrows. Bernie, I'll help you and Sylvain with the Imperial troops. Indec dash." She glanced at the river. "Can you?" "Easily, little sister," he said with a small grin. "I promise, I'm not that old." Bernie let out a little giggle at that. Byleth nearly joined her, since it was kind of a funny thing to hear from him. "Good to hear, let's go," she said. Bernadetta let out a half-frightened, half-determined yell and urged her horse forward. Ingrid joined her, swooping overhead with light streaming from Lewin, Typhon, as Byleth ran after them. Indec made his way through the alleyway and made his way across the grass in a seemingly leisurely manner, firing at whatever Imperials were head and shoulders above the people they were chasing. The gigantic demonic beast howled, rattling Byleth's eardrums. It was being hailed with arrows from the United Army on the other side of the river, but it didn't even seem to notice this. Its body rippled and twisted hideously as it grabbed the building next to it in both hands. It came away with two gigantic chunks of stone, which it then flung underhanded right at them. Byleth cursed and closed her eyes, focusing on her magic. Rewarp, rewarp. In a flash, she was teleported behind the Imperial line, leaving her in a perfect position to swing her sword upward and unleash its power to slice through both projectiles. It still sprayed hundreds and hundreds of stone projectiles all over the place. One hit her in the stomach, causing her blinding pain and knocking her flat on her back. Of course, she wasn't the only person who got hit. She heard a lot of yelling and pained cries right behind him. A knight appeared right above her, a lance poised to skewer through her stomach. Byleth opened her palm and cast Nosferatu right up at his face. The rush of healing magic erased the internal wound in her stomach while the man screamed and collapsed behind her. Rolling over onto her knee, Byleth nearly got her eye taken out by a sniper aiming back at her. Fortunately, moments later an arrow slammed into the man from behind, taking him out. Byleth cast thunder at the other knight charging her and got to her feet just in time to see the gigantic beast picking up another chunk of stone and throwing it her way. The sheer size of it forced her to use rewarp, moving herself back behind Sylvain as the redhead crashed through a line of mages. Without missing a beat, she swung the Creator's sword, Suthi's I'm sorry, and slashed down the warlock that was in mid-cast of death, causing a spell backfire that splashed onto the man behind him, incapacitating them both as blood spurted from his new sucking chest wound. Sylvain slashed through an armored knight, cursing, then cast Balganon. "Keep running. Get through the alley, the area behind is secure," he yelled at the civilians, who were sobbing with relief as they darted past him. "What a fucking mess. Will that monster even feel anything we throw at it, Professor? It's so fucking huge. We'll bring it down to our level." Byleth responded, swinging the sword and sending another group of men to the ground. Across from them, Bernadetta was firing a volley while circling around a number of civilians who had fallen to the ground, unable to keep running with the injuries they had sustained. Byleth started to rush towards them, one eye on Indec who was on the riverbank now. "Hold the line for another half-minute," Okay. Got it, the redhead promised. Ingrid threw a javelin down from above, taking out a sniper who'd made the mistake of ignoring her in favor of trying to shoot down her childhood friend. The war masters at the back were laughing at them. They felt confident, despite the relic weapons brought to bear, because there were only 4 of them. The amusement drained out of their eyes as the ground started to tremble, but it wasn't the work of the demonic beast, who had turned toward the side to try and snatch Seath out of the air as he flew loops around it. For a second, everyone, Imperial and civilian alike, looked around wildly to figure out what was causing it. Having a split second to see the sudden, wild white wall of water suddenly surging out of the river toward them was just long enough for shock, and then fear, to set in before it slammed into them. Byleth winced at the crash as massive waves swamped the grass field, knocking over the Imperials, breaking limbs, and swallowing up the entire Imperial force. The civilians cried out, shocked when the water washed harmlessly up to their knees. Byleth felt a current tugging on her ankles, but nothing more. The Imperials were flailing, however, struggling to sit up or even move as the water relentlessly dragged them toward the river and filled the lungs of those who were unlucky enough to try and scream underwater. Indek stood up, bow slung over his shoulder and ankles still in the water as their opponents were discarded, powerless, on the beach. The water swirled around him, rumbling like an avalanche. He smiled and pointed down toward the demonic beast. What the hell was that? Sylvain gasped. Did he just dash? Byleth let out a small, weak laugh and said, I'll tell you in a little while. Yay, I get to have this conversation again, but I don't want to make Suthies do it. I might as well, Suthies sighed. There's really no reason to keep the rest of the delinquents in the dark about my presence with you, is there? I guess not, but I don't want to make you. Oh, don't worry so much. I'll be fine, I don't want Indek to have to tell that story twice. Suthies responded chidingly. Now keep an eye on that beast. It looks like it might come apart at the joints, but I wouldn't count on it. Byleth was already running as they talked. Sylvain and Bernadetta were ahead of her, but not by much. Their, understandable, trepidation was obvious. Ingrid was circling overhead with Seath, each occasionally dive-bombing in an attempt to blind the monster. The monster roared in frustration, but it moved rather slowly, sluggishly, even as it tried to swipe the 2 out of the sky. It was almost as if its shoulders couldn't support the weight of its arms. It made a certain sick amount of sense. It was a patchwork monster, a proof of concept. Byleth felt the ground rumbling under her feet again. A lot of alarmed or elated cheering erupted from the other side of the riverbank as the water spilled over its banks. She grinned to herself and voiced her plan. Sylvain, Bernadetta, aim for the legs, make sure to keep one eye up so you can see which way it's going to topple. Oh okay. Bernadetta squeaked out. Again, despite her obvious fear, she spurred Nico onward while raising the inexhaustible. Byleth, a familiar warm pride welling up in her chest, accepted Sylvain's hand and let him pull her up onto his horse's back before taking off in earnest. Indeka's attack hit the giant demonic beast before they reached it, a massive wave striking the legs and rapidly filling the square corner it was standing in. The beast stumbled but kept standing. It teetered wildly, however, kept trying to lift up its feet but wasn't able to escape the inexorable currents pulling hard on its feet. Bernadetta reached it and unleashed a storm, the inexhaustible blazing as the ghostly arrows flew outward. They pierced right through the silver-blue magic barrier and rammed into the legs below the knee, and in it, the demonic beast roared and tried to swipe at her, but it was lumbering. Bernadetta rode out of the way and Sylvain leaned forward to urge on a little more speed. Byleth hissed as they ran under the creature's arms and between its legs. For a moment the 2 massive pillars of stinking, rotting flesh that hissed with red and orange blood, the stench was so overpowering it blinded her for a split second. Sylvain probably had it worse, but he kept his bearings, turning his horse around and thrusting his lance upwards. Ruined Sky was a lance of wind, the voice of a raging storm. The hurricane force winds formed what was almost a drill. It flew up from the lance's blade, Fenrir's fangs. His power struck the flesh where the left leg met the beast's groin and ripped right through it, drilling out the other side and severing the leg. Byleth slapped the mare's flank hard to make her run out of the way. Sylvain cussed frantically as a deluge of black blood poured down on them, coating their skin as the limb crashed down to the ground, missing them by inches. Most pressingly, the beast was now toppling down backwards, and that much black flesh landing on them. An impact above them racked the body, pausing it for a few split seconds to absorb the shock waves of burning quake striking its neck, severing its massive head. The currents that had held the beast in place relaxed, allowing the mare to make a mad dash out of the creature's shadow and out into safety as the head crashed to the ground a few yards away. And then the beast's body hit the ground with an earth-shaking crash. Literally earth-shaking, Sylvain's mare and Nico both stumbled and nearly threw them all to the ground at the resulting quake of the enormous body crashing through buildings and the protective wall around the city. The impact threw up a massive wall of dust, blowing past them. Sylvain was muttering a lot of unhappy words while rubbing at his eyes while Byleth clung to his back, whimpering as she tried to blink the dust, dirt, and ash out of her eyes. "Fuck," Sylvain groaned as he turned them around, and both of them observed the massive corpse that was slowly turning into ash. "What the fucking fuck was that fucking thing?" Bernadetta just whimpered in response. "I think," Byleth coughed, "that's a sign that Agartha is a little worried." "Great. Fantastic," Sylvain moaned despairingly. "Do I even want to KN? No, you know what? I don't want to know what that fucking thing was made of. Please, please tell me they won't have any more of those freaks." "I'd love to, but we haven't been that lucky yet," Byleth grumbled as Indek pulled the river back to its banks. Sylvain just groaned in response. As they made their way back to the civilians, Seath and Ingrid flying down to join them and help Yuri get them all moved to a medical encampment, Byleth was aware of Claude flying leisurely circles around the other side of the banks. "What's going on over there?" she yelled up at the flying duo. "Felix forced Maximus Varley off his horse," Seath reported as Yuri vanished with another pair of injured civilians. "He's currently dueling the man. His immediate honor guard has either been taken out by Ash, Glenn, and Atra or forced to flee by Claude." Bernadetta let out a small, incomprehensible squeaking sound. She turned and stared across the river, searching for her blue-haired swordsman. Byleth blinked twice and then slowly felt a knowing smirk cross her face. "Is he handling himself?" she asked. "Yes, quite well in fact. Varley is putting up a good resistance, but he underestimated his opponent and is struggling to regain the advantage." Seath gave her a little grin. Even the mild-mannered bishop, with his inhuman patience for humanity's weaknesses, was obviously amused by the Imperial Lord's plight. "His psychotic drive is what's holding this attack together," Ingrid remarked. "If Felix drops him, the rest ought to surrender." "I agree," Byleth said, looking between her allies. "Inlian, can you open a path for us?" "Yuri, please finish evacuating these people, Ingrid will escort you just to be safe." "Actually, I was about to bring Flane over," Yuri interrupted. "I think we can leave them in her capable hands, yes." The look on his face said a different story, namely, "I don't want to miss this for anything." "True," she acknowledged after a minute. "Please hurry, though." Indek waved a hand, and before their amazed eyes the river parted to form a smooth walkway to the far banks and close to where Felix was fighting. Bernadetta instantly directed Nico forward, her heart visibly in her throat. Byleth waited until Yuri returned in a flash with a somewhat tired but very determined-looking Flane, who began to prepare fortify again. How many times had she used that spell over the course of the day? She swore every time she saw the girl in the corner of her eye she was casting it, yet she didn't look grey at all. Amazing. Then she hurried after her purple-haired archer with a slight spring in her step. Yuri appeared right at her side in a flash when she skidded to a halt in the street and saw the battle for herself. It was quite the scene, something out a romantic, chivalry fable. Oh, that was going to annoy Felix so much when he heard of it. Rodrigue, Glenn, Atra, and Leone had taken down the sub-commanders and the man's retainers, either leaving them insensate on the ground or pinned and defenseless. The Imperials and various civilians who weren't on the ground were ignoring their enemy in favor of staring at the fight as though mesmerized. Ivory had perched on the roof of the mostly undamaged hotel overlooking the fight, head lowered so Claude could watch, likely lamenting the lack of tarts or any confection to watch the scene with. Dimitri was leaning against a building, his fingers repeatedly tapping on the length of his silver lance as he resisted the urge to intervene. Felix was largely uninjured, except for a sluggishly bleeding arm wound that he was completely ignoring. Maximus Varley, on the other hand, was a wreck, his once ornate armor was cracked and shattered in multiple places, he was limping slightly, blood caked his arms and legs. Byleth couldn't help but be mildly impressed that the man was still fighting rather than surrender. Where is all this righteous anger rooted? Maximus raged, swinging a lance at Felix. From this is an example. When animals snap at their masters, it's prudent to cull the herd. If you want to coddle your pets up north, be my guest, but don't pretend that the filthy commons have the right to throw out their lord. Felix didn't respond. Unlike Yuri or Claude, he rarely bothered with trash talk during battle. He had a singular, cold focus. Rodrigue wasn't about to let that slide, however. Any man who cannot respect those who look to him for protection loses any right to have power over them, the shield of Faerghus spat contemptuously. Frostbitten wolf. I'll teach you to interfere in the business of your betters. Felix's crest flashed, and he carved Maximus's sword straight down the blade and into the man's hand, impaling it. The lord shrieked in agony as the young wolf wrenched the sword of Merylta out. Shut up. Do you always run your mouth this much? Felix said contemptuously. All you've proven is just how weak you are. I am a Count of Adrestia. Maximus wheezed, wildly swinging his shield in an attempt to bash Felix in the face. You can't win loyalty without threatening to slaughter people in retaliation. You endlessly scream about deserving their respect by dint of a cosmic accident, when most people live past their second birthday without thinking the world owes them something for that achievement, Felix scathed, kicking the side of his knee to nearly knock it out of joint. You heap abuse on your daughter, your servants, your people, all who have no recourse against you, and think that doing so makes you powerful. You're so desperate to increase your name that you would sell your daughter as if she were a bed slave, when if you were actually a man of capability and respect, you wouldn't need to stoop to gutter crime. With a smooth move, he hacked into Maximus's shield arm, slicing down to the bone and cutting off the straps holding it in place. Your name will disappear. He followed that up with a kick to the man's groin, staggering him as he howled and clutched at his arm. All memory of you will disappear. He kicked the man's face, knocking him down to the ground. Your lands will be taken and given to Bernadetta von Regan, the girl you tortured to sate your greed. Your title will go to your long-suffering wife, who should be held in admiration for not suffocating you in your sleep. Felix smirked, slamming his heel down on the man's arm as he tried to reach his shield. You won't die. No, no, no. He said coldly. In fact, you'll be let go to live a free life. You'll be put on a boat and sent from Fodlan, all ports closing to you afterwards. You will never return. Maximus's face turned an interesting gray-green pallor. Adrestia doesn't belong to you, you cannot. It will soon, Felix said. Why? Why? Felix hissed. The woman I love is still suffering because of you. You abused her, called her worthless, convinced her no one would ever want her. One of the bravest people I've ever met, still lives if fear of you. You worthless, pathetic, spineless waste of air. You aren't worthy to carry her shoes. Maximus's eyes widened, his gaze had drifted over to Bernadetta, who'd slid off her horse a few yards away and had clapped her hands over her mouth, staring at Felix. Her. That, little, fail dash. Yes. Her. Felix spat, cutting him off as his face twisted with livid anger. You will never hurt her again. He then slammed the hilt of the sword of Merylta into the man's face, knocking him out cold. That was a straight line if Byleth had ever heard one. She stepped forward to make herself visible. Your leader is fallen. Surrender and pledge your loyalty to the new Lady of Varley. She swept her arm to indicate Bernadetta. The Varley men who had surrounded the street glanced at each other, then dropped their weapons. Rodrigue and Glenn were both grinning, the latter a bit more obviously than the former as cheers erupted all around them. Yuri strode over to Maximus and nudged him with his boot, an amused look on his face. Nicely done. I'll deal with him now. Felix snorted. Can I trust you not to gut the man who tried to have you beaten to death? And risk the beautiful send-off you have planned for him? Perish the thought, Yuri laughed, before vanishing with the unconscious body. Felix muttered something under his breath and turned around to suddenly find himself face to face with a wide-eyed Bernadetta. Oh, you. There you are, he said awkwardly. I thought you were, he waved vaguely to the interior of HRYM. Do you mean it? She squeaked out, disbelief in her voice. Huh. What you just said, you said you loved me? Bernadetta sounded like she couldn't understand the words she was saying, her hands were pressed against her chest. Felix sheathed the sword, kicking at the ground uncertainly, suddenly looking significantly less fearsome than just moments ago. That's, I don't talk for the pleasure of hearing my own voice, he babbled awkwardly, looking everywhere but at her. Throwing the word love around like it means no more than hello is Sylvain's hobby. Why do you need to ask? Why you love? Bernadetta's eyes welled up. Me? Why me? I am weak. I'm scared of everything. I see can't get out of my room some mornings. I misunderstand the dumbest things. I am not good enough for you. Why you're so brave and strong, you not afraid of anything dash. Felix clapped a hand over her mouth. Stop that, he protested hotly. That sounds like his words. Fuck him. Me, brave? You're 10 times the courageous warrior I am. You don't let fear stop you from fighting or helping the people you love. I can't choke out an apology to my best friends, I can swing a sword around, that doesn't mean I can compare to you. That's. So, stop saying stupid shit. I know who you are, and I neither need nor want anyone else, just you, Felix fumbled on the stop, then went on. I want you to stay with me forever, Felix. I'm no use at this, fuck, words, why are words so hard? Damn it, will you, MMPH. Whatever babbling he'd been posed to descend into was cut off when Bernadetta jumped up and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him on the lips. Naturally that shot up the volume of the cheering all around them by multiple decibels. Felix flailed for a moment, looking like he might fall over before his hands settled on her hips and he regained his balance. At least physically, he was frozen in place, like he couldn't believe this was happening. This needs to be made a fable, Suthies snickered. I need to see his face when the copies are printed and become popular with all the starry-eyed girls looking for true love. Byleth grinned in agreement, watching the scene for a few minutes before turning to find Ferdinand. Chapter 70. The citizens of HRYM were still celebrating when Dimitri vaulted awake with the first rays of dawn, frantically blinking away the fire and death that had swamped his nightmares. He sat up and rested his elbow on his knee, burying his face in one hand as he tried to regulate his breathing. The clamor of the ghosts was at a dull throb, mostly drowned out by the music and celebrations ringing out from the streets below the mansion. His nightmares had been more mangled than they had been in a long time. There was no rhyme or reason to the scenes that had flickered behind his eyes, no connecting narrative thread. He was so used to bad dreams replaying old memories to him that it was almost odd to experience a nonsensical mixture of horrific imagery and distorted screaming. Little parts of pictures looked familiar, a corpse here, a moment there, but overall, it was jumbled. He couldn't recall anything any of those ghosts had said to him. A chill passed over his skin. Sleepily he glanced at the window, wondering if he'd left it open before retiring to bed. The mansion they had been given to rest in had once belonged to the HRYM family, before the uprising, then it had been passed to Ludwig von Eger, and now to Ferdinand. It had been fortunate enough to largely avoid the damage that had been hailed down on the city-state. All the former students, along with Rodrigue and Lady Judith, were sleeping in the various rooms within, being pampered as much as possible given the state of everyone and everything. The room that had been given to Byleth was the former master bedroom. He'd gravitated to her before the sun went down. Usually they kept his nightmares away. It was incredible, truly, how much comfort and peace of mind he got simply by being in their presence. But his demons refused to be dismissed without a fight. Even though he hadn't seen his father's figure since that morning, the angry and grieving cries of anonymous ghosts still dogged his steps. Byleth murmured silently in her sleep, tossing onto her side at his abrupt movement. He winced and leaned over her, hoping he hadn't woken her or clawed up. The Golden Prince had stirred slightly, the blankets falling off his bare shoulders. Dimitri gently readjusted them over him and Byleth, who'd somehow managed to tangle them down at her waist. I wonder what she's dreaming of. He flexed his hands, trying to will away the trembling. Then he leaned over, brushing a feather-light kiss on Byleth's forehead. She'd exhausted herself in that battle, using divine pulse to the point of potential danger in order to save as many people as she could reach. Claude had tired himself out too. Once his anger had the massacre had burnt out, hopefully they would both continue to sleep well. Dmitri carefully slipped out of the bed, and got dressed. He knew his mind was too busy to go back to sleep now. Grabbing his overcoat off the wall, the young king carefully slipped out, closing the door behind him. "We're so close to Inver, we'll be at the gates very soon." "El. What will you do?" A mixture of anger and melancholy nearly knocked the air out of his lungs. He pressed one hand onto the wall, leaning on it and guiding himself to the stairwell. "Wrong foot, Dmitri, you're supposed to lead with your right." Her voice, young and impetuous and determined even back then, rang through his mind. He could still see that moment clear as crystal in his mind, her guiding him around the room with a face of equal parts disapproval and fierce pleasure on her face as she taught him. It was one of the few times he'd been absolutely sure she'd been enjoying herself. Even when they were playing together, there was something leaning heavily on her mind. He remembered finding her standing at a window early in the morning, staring out south toward Inver and clutching a small pendant one of her sisters had gotten for her. Christine. Justine. Was that her name? What had become of her? Had she gone mad, or succumbed to plague, or found herself at the mercy of Agartha somehow? Melancholy had followed her like a cloud. He'd done his best to distract her, raise her spirits up, give her a sense of control in her life. "Come on, quickly, he'll only be distracted for a minute," he'd warned her, tugging her toward the front hall as Arundel walked toward Count Rowe. Elle had blinked twice, grinned madly at him and promptly took off for the front yard, leaving him scrambling after her. What she'd hated the most was being paraded in front of the Eastern Northern lords, saying she felt like a piece of meat the way they would look at her. He stumbled a bit, his knees were a bit stiff from some of the acrobatics he'd had to pull the previous days to take out snipers. "I'm sick of sewing. They've been forcing me to do this all morning. You said you'd show me the armory." She put her hands on her hips, waiting impatiently as he scrambled to finish the remains of his breakfast to join her while his father watched in indulgent amusement. "Well? Let's go." Dmitri stopped walking, turning against the wall and slumping against it, lowering his head as the memories continued to play behind his half-closed eyes. "Are you sure, Elle? What if you fall?" he fretted as Edelgard continued to climb up the side of the palace, standing somewhat precariously on a windowsill. He remembered almost hearing her roll her eyes at him before swinging herself up onto the elegant rooftop, then rolling over onto her stomach and reaching down to him. He carefully climbed up after her all while she hissed her special brand of encouragement, snark overlaying genuine compliments, until he could reach her and accept her help up onto the roof. The sunset caused the snow to glitter like diamonds of all the rainbow's colors. Elle laughed in amazement and gave him a death glare as he pulled her hood up to keep the falling snow out of her hair. She'd never been afraid of anything. That had always been her defining characteristic. "I'm not going to leave her here to be squeezed by brats or kicked by the street guards," she snapped, cradling the whining kitten against her chest. Its back leg was bleeding, and it was horribly thin. They'd found it curled up in the gutter, trying to hide in a pile of dead leaves. She'd chewed out the guard who had voiced the opinion that it should be disposed of, railing at him until he was practically cowering away from her. "I wasn't suggesting we should," he protested indigently, reaching out and carefully scratching between its ears. The kitten mewed weakly in response, trying to nuzzle his finger. "I think my father's physician isn't occupied at the moment. She's a fan of cats." Elle's expression grew a little less fierce, but no less determined. She stood up and the two of them ran down the street with a singular purpose. The edges of his eyes were growing blurry. He swiped uselessly at them, pressing his other palm against the wall as he shivered under the weight of his emotions. Why was this happening now? He hadn't felt anything after her mask broke in the holy tomb except for rage and that burning feeling of betrayal. Why now, after this final cruelty she'd inflicted on Fodlan, on her own people? "You shouldn't let them talk to you like that. You're too nice, Dmitri." She put her hands on her hips and glared daggers at the door they'd just been escorted through. Dmitri had voiced an opinion on potentially raising taxes, and Lord Gautier had chided him for interrupting. "Make your voice heard. You're smarter than they think." Dmitri felt tears drip down his cheeks and brushed them away, shaking his head. "What happened to you, Elle?" He wondered despairingly. Why did you choose war and death? Why didn't you ask me for help? He'd told himself it didn't matter, that she no longer mattered, and it was easy to keep to that for the first few months. But his loves, his friends, and the sorrow of war had eaten away at that righteous fury. Now he couldn't think about her without a streak of confusion and grief. Could he have helped her? Could he, if he'd realized what was going on, have convinced her to leave this path of destruction? What had led her to believe this was the only way? He fumbled with one of his coat pockets, removing a familiar dagger from it and staring longingly at the sapphire-studded hilt. The silly notion kept welling up in his chest. He knew what he had to do, and yet he wanted to talk to her. He wanted to spare her. Somehow, some part of his still bleeding heart wanted her to be able to walk away from this nightmare, even after everything she'd done, from partnering with Agartha to unleashing Maximus Varley on her people. Claude's heart had been hardened against her. He'd seen it in his prince's expression after the battle as they tried to clean up the devastated city as best they could. His eyes were hard chips of cold jade as he moved bodies, comforted orphaned children, and put out the fires that had raged through so many homes, leaving their owners with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Dmitri had known before he'd coldly said as much that he was out of mercy for Edelgard. She lost any right to call herself an emperor. This is unforgivable. I don't care what reason she has or what she's fighting for, the Hresvelg legacy ends with her one way or another. Knowing that Claude was still coming down from his battle rage didn't dissuade Dmitri from believing he meant every word. Despite his anger, feelings of betrayal, his heart ached at the thought. Could they really not dash? The wooden stairs creaked under light footsteps. Startled out of his thoughts, Dmitri straightened up, clutching the hilt of the dagger instinctively while looking over the railing of the spiral staircase. He remained very still, stepping backward into the shadow of a bookcase. Surely it was someone familiar, but a head of dark hair peeked up over the floor, dark gray eyes peered warily down the hallway. After a few seconds, a small girl emerged from the stairs, wearing a heavy overcoat that couldn't disguise her bone-white skin, or the knife she was clutching in one hand. Dmitri breathed out slowly, surprise coiling in his stomach like a venomous snake. That was one of the Agarthan child mages they'd captured on the march. How had she gotten out of the prison wagon? She must know rewarp. Remarkable. The girl crept up the stairs, staring uneasily down the stairs. She stepped carefully, cringing when the wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. She didn't seem to notice him, staring intently straight ahead, to the room he'd come from. She licked her lips anxiously, hesitating. Dmitri stayed very still as she approached the entrance of the hallway. Just the three of them, the girl whispered. Just the three of them. 3 bodies, for home. She nodded to herself, then started to walk down the hallway. Dmitri shoved the dagger into his coat. The small gesture made her pause and blink, looking into the shadows. Her brow furrowed, and then her gray eyes grew really wide as she focused on him. Verdammt, she whimpered. Magic started to swirl around her hand. Dmitri darted from the darkness and grabbed her arm. She yipped in shock. He dropped to his knees and grabbed the knife handle, snapping it between his fingers as he wrestled her down. She flailed against him, trying to squirm free and pushing fire magic out through her hands. Wincing, Dmitri put his hand on her slender neck and touched his fingers lightly against either side of it. Stop, please, he said quietly when she froze. I don't want to hurt you. She didn't respond verbally, only a tiny whimper slipped past her lips. Dmitri glanced at the stairwell, half expecting to see other child mages they'd captured along the way appear in her wake. But as he held her there, waiting, no one else appeared, no sign anyone else was awake in the building. Letting out a sigh, he looked down at his prisoner, who was shivering in fear. Despite her clear and obvious intent to assassinate himself, Byleth and Claude, he couldn't really feel intimidated by a tiny, shaking child. No, all he felt was disquiet and pity. How did you get in here? He wondered. I know the prison wagons are being watched. The child snorted, trying to toss her head confidently as she twisted to look up at him. The guards underestimate me, she said, her voice wavering a bit. One of them kept telling the other to take my chains off, said he felt sorry for me. Condescending as all hells. And the others fell for it, too. Ah. That explained it. I think it's more likely they felt guilty for putting a child in chains, Dmitri said quietly. We left our homes in hopes of protecting our children. It feels wrong to imprison one. Your children, the girl's her storm gray eyes staring with wariness and unease running underneath her thin mask of defiance. Dogs protect their packs. It's the one thing that stops them from being easily led around by the nose. The young king wasn't certain if she was intentionally obliquely referencing the tragedy and the subsequent massacre of the Dusker people, but he took in a few deep breaths to subdue his knee-jerk reaction nonetheless. She's just parroting back what Thales has said her entire life. She can't understand what she's saying. I'm not sure what you're trying to say. Why should it matter if you're not one of mine? Huh. She blinked rapidly at him. Of course it matters. I'm an enemy. You devour your weakened enemies, feed your people with them. Sorry, but I'm not fat. The last bit was spat out, completely at odds with the raw flash of fear in her eyes. Dmitri blew out a breath and snorted. If Thales is going to tell you lies, he should at least try to reframe the truth rather than spew nonsense solely meant to shock and horrify. I'm almost too exasperated to be offended. No one in Fodlan practices cannibalism, at least, no one welcome in society. You're in no danger from that, I assure you. The girl scowled mistrustfully at him, refusing to engage him. Dmitri pondered what he should do. Clearly she was fairly clever to get out of the prison wagon and all the way to this floor without tipping off any of the guards. Immediately he worried that his soldiers might feel compelled to mistreat her to prevent any further mischief. He had to convince her to return peacefully, somehow. What's your name? He asked. My NA-. She squirmed in his grip, incredulity and confusion causing her gray eyes to sharpen. What are you doing? I'm Dmitri, the young king forged on, shifting his grip just a bit so she could move around without being able to escape him. What's your name? Marion, the girl said shortly, almost against her will. I know who you are. You're the boy king of the north, priority target 3. You bear the grim dragon's blood, enhanced strength and the Eridbar relic. You've repeatedly displayed unhinged behavior and are extremely dangerous. Is that so? He shook his head faintly. That's not very much. Are you trying to talk me to death before you feed me to the dragons? Marion demanded, the tremor in her voice undermining her defiance. I'm not going to hurt you, Marion. Dmitri responded gently. You dumb mutt. I'm an enemy. You're toying with me, aren't you? You could snap my neck with one hand, but you're just needling me. This is stupid. Let go. She was hissing, clearly afraid to wake anyone else. You're not my enemy. Marion stopped squirming and stared blankly up at him. I'm not. She said blankly. I don't see any reason you should be. You're crazy, the child said decisively, her gray eyes storming as she tried to read his expression for some sort of tell that would clarify his thoughts to her. I know they said you're unhinged, but you're actually crazy. I'm Agar then. You're a surface savage. Of course we're enemies. Why? Internally, Dmitri pondered if he'd spontaneously switched heads with Claude. He wasn't exactly a witty debater, and he'd always left swaying/confusing the enemy to the brunette. But right now, he was suddenly overwhelmed with the need to prevent one battle from ending in bloodshed, and to prevent this child from being one more corpse in the grotesque monument of Agartha's pride. Why? You do realize I was planning to stab you a minute ago, right? Why you can't be that dumb, Marion sputtered. Dmitri shrugged slightly. My friends and I have traded plenty of cuts and bruises over the years during training. Marion said nothing to that, she just stared dumbfounded at him. Dmitri cautiously let go of one of her hands and ruffled her golden brown hair, mimicking the affectionate/playful gesture he'd seen Claude give Bernadetta and Ash on several occasions. She flinched slightly at first, but, encouragingly, didn't attempt to get away from him. Have you ever been in Fodlan before? He asked. How long were you in the village? I was brought up for the first time after the puppet emperor started her war, the first step in reclaiming the surface. Marion said neutrally, her expression slipping back into a sort of wariness. The Chancellor had need of his most loyal to reclaim the surface, and my duty is logistical retrieval missions. And to dispose of problems, when necessary. Dimitri's stomach roiled at how easily and flatly she said this. Have you seen the ocean yet? Or have you not traveled that far? The ocean? No, I haven't. There hasn't been need for me. Her brow furrowed fiercely as she seemed to briefly war with herself. Then suddenly she blurted out, is the water truly black as death stretching out to the horizon where the sun drowns each evening? It's more blue than black, unless you've traveled far out from shore. Huh, she blinked. Petir said it was black. When you're over the fathomless depths, it can look black. Dimitri acknowledged. Have you been sunburning a lot? Atra mentioned at one point that her skin was terribly sensitive the first 2 years she lived above ground. Sunburn dash? Ah. That's been the worst. Marian made a face, flailing her free hand in frustration. She seemed to forget where she was for a moment as she started to rant. I had to crouch on a rooftop for hours, keeping an eye on some black-haired twit loyal to the puppet and make sure he didn't harm the Einherjar while they were in stasis after retreating from the island. I had to wear this stupid with open shoulders to blend in. When I went to go to sleep I couldn't even twitch without this horrible pain needling me into unconsciousness. Bits of my skin were peeling off. Even after I was given a lotion it felt like my shoulders were on fire. I couldn't go to sleep until the dead of night because whenever I so much as twitched the pain came back. I felt like a corpse the next morning dash. She ran out of breath for a moment, panting with indignation. All that because of some stupid black-haired twit, who couldn't take a hint if it punched him in the face. I had to hit him with death twice, and even then he kept trying to sneak back into the hotel room the Einherjar were sleeping in all fucking day. Stupid jackass. The mud thinks he's so bloody smart, but he never even knew I was there. It was like trying to corral a particularly yappy dog, you know, the kind that has no concept of its own side and keeps baiting much bigger, stronger hounds even as you try to spare its stupid hide. Would this black-haired twit happen to be called Hubert? Dimitri asked. Marian snorted. I dunno what the mutt's name was, they all seem the same to me. He just pissed me off and got me sunburned to hell and back while trying to harm the Einherjar. I'm going to poison his next meal. She tilted her head in thought. He and his fellow mutts do trail after the puppet everywhere, yapping his head off whenever she cracks a nail. It's pathetic. Doesn't he know that she only has power because the High Chancellor permits it? What do you mean by that? Dimitri's heartbeat picked up, wondering if he could sneak some information out of her while she was worked up. When the Emperor, I suppose she's the Chancellor's puppet, declared war on us, she never mentioned him. Did she truly go to war on his command? She thinks it's her idea, but it serves the High Chancellor's plans. A war that will cripple half the continent, leave it weakened and bloody and ripe for the taking. Marian responded, snorting in annoyance. She was molded for this purpose several years back. She was implanted with the Fellstar's crest to give her the power to slay dragons. She was put back into Adresta. She fumbled her pronunciation, muttering under her breath, this damned language, before continuing, because the 7 nobles were indebted to us and wouldn't cause problems while we prepared. She couldn't have ousted them and grabbed power without the High Chancellor's magnanimous assistance. He even promised her a fief in exchange for her services in slaying the dragons, but she's completely ungrateful about it, blatantly flaunting the fact she plans to usurp him once she bleeds the rest of Fodlan dry. She snickered merrily. She actually thinks she's got one over us, can you believe it? It's the funniest fucking thing. She gave orders to her mutt to kill the Einherjar, believing she gave us the slip while I was standing right around a corner. She thought I was one of her maids. She relaxed in his grip as she fell into a helpless fit of malicious giggles. I suppose that kind of ineptitude is amusing when the opposing forces display it, Dimitri agreed, managing to hide his alarm, shock, and distress at the last second. It was no easy feat. Did I hear that right? The Fellstar is what Agartha called Suthies. Is she saying that Edelgard, somehow, has the crest of flames? No, that doesn't make any sense. Byleth has the crest, Suthies' heart, and Suthies' spirit with her. She must have misunderstood. We're going to turn that palace into the most elegant apartment complex ever, Marian said cheerfully. For how stupid they are, these people have really amazingly beautiful art. I can't wait to bring grandmother up from Shambhala. Our apartment is too small and chilly to be good for someone her age, and she loves her art. Once she's sleeping on these soft beds, her bad back won't bother her so much and the servants will take care of her needs. Hell, everyone from my neighborhood could come up. It could easily take everyone, and we'll have the most amazing view of the sky, she sighed. I can't wait for grandmother to see the sky. Does your grandmother take care of you? You seem very self-sufficient, but I have a hard time imagining you take care of the house alone. Yeah, my parents were soldiers, they died on a mission to the surface. She scowled at him. Animals killed both of them, even though Mom had a picture of me in her coat. Didn't matter a whit to them that I needed them, course, I'm not sure what I expected. She shook her head. So I entered the militia to provide for her. Money's tight in our quarter of the city, especially after that plague hit us years back. She groaned. I have to warn her about the sunburns. Our medicine's as good as it gets, but it's expensive, and I don't want her dealing with these. I swear the stupid scars are still bothering me, ugh. You can write her a letter, if you want. I doubt Seeth will try and forbid it. Though he will read it to make sure you aren't slipping any information about our army into it. I can't use something that outdated and expect her to get it. Messages have to go through the generals, and non-urgent communication is currently restricted. I have to wait. She's probably worrying, she can't help it. Marian paused her rambling and looked up at him in confusion. Wait, why am I telling you all of this? I'm getting the sense that you haven't really been able to talk to anyone, Dmitri said, grasping the opening in her defenses. How about we go out into the city? I'm not certain, but we might be able to find some confections somewhere. Marian eyed him warily. You're trying to bribe me into giving up information. She half accused, half questioned. No. I promise, I'll just lend a sympathetic ear. If you can talk to me like I'm a fellow human, you'll start to think of me as a fellow human, likely without even noticing. If that will allow me to reach you past the poison Thales has fed you all your life, it will be worth any potential assassination attempts. The Agarthan child stared intensely at him, as though she was trying to read the runes of his soul. Then she slumped and sighed, I guess I can't stop you. I am your prisoner. It's a start. Maybe. Hopefully. Dmitri thought he might have heard his father chuckle at that, but it was gone too soon for him to be sure. Astonishingly, Dmitri did end up finding a bakery that not only hadn't been ransacked during the riots, but still had edible tarts, cakes and rolls in its shelves. It took a bit of walking. Marian kept glancing up at him like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, and wasn't sure what to make of him when he gave her a tart without any strings attached. But she was still a child, and easily swayed by sweets. Somewhere, Lysathea was twitching and suppressing the strange desire to punch him, probably, and it didn't take much cautious prodding before she dissolved into ranting out of pure, distilled childish frustration. I hate working in the puppet's palace. It's not just that her too big for her boots attitude that's insufferable, I hate the way her generals and her lords and her soldiers look at me. They look at me like I'm something they scraped off their boot, like I'm a bug. They think I'm a servant, yeah? Well, her lords put themselves above their own people, dogs looking down on other dogs. How delusional can you get? And they vent their frustration on us every time you lot succeed. There was this one man who broke 2 of my ribs kicking me repeatedly, screaming about how this was unacceptable and how dare they defy the will of Adresta. I poisoned his food and stabbed him to death in his bed. Good riddance. Which honestly was what made half of what she said so disturbing. She genuinely didn't seem troubled by the killings she'd been ordered to carry out, confident in good and evil as was presented to her in a way only children were. Atra spotted them in the middle of one of Marian's rants. She'd been out early, helping with cleanup. Her eyes grew really wide for a minute, then grew calculated, then she'd cautiously strode up and offered her own experience dealing with imperial nobility. He kept insulting me even when I was standing in his room, his retainers bleeding on the ground, holding 2 swords, one of which was on fire, Atra remarked dryly. He was so convinced that some gutter rat couldn't hurt a man of noble breeding, that I actually had to slash his cheek open before he started taking me seriously. Yes. That. Marian raged, grabbing another tart and scarfing it down. Her initial wariness of the treats hadn't lasted, she was making like Lysathea in short order. How can a person be so stupid and still be capable of breathing? The puppet goes on and on about opening surfacers' minds to true wisdom by killing the dragons, when really she should just be grateful they are capable of walking and talking at the same time. And the puppet, ugh, the puppet. How can someone so arrogant yet so completely lacking in common sense not have died years ago? The worst part is that she thinks she's so smart, and whenever I'm called to the capital to perform surveillance on her, I have to listen to her clueless know-it-all rambling and insults until I want to cave my ears off. You've been winning this whole time, yet she still acts like nothing's wrong and she's going to save the world and remake it into a perfect kingdom and you ugh. She dropped her chin on her arms, staring up at him. I don't get it, you're unhinged with manic episodes, but you've actually talked a bit of sense. Your people actually trust you, and you have allies rather than steadily alienating everyone around you. Not like her. Why didn't the High Chancellor choose you to be the Dragon Slayer? You'd make better use of the honor than her. Dmitri swallowed hard over his first 3 reactions to the question. She doesn't understand, he reminded himself as he silently counted backwards from 5 more than once. She doesn't know any better. Why do the dragons have to die? He asked her. Because they smother humanity, using us for their own gains, Marion responded without hesitation. Dmitri bit his lip as a very harsh and very angry response bubbled up in his throat, spurred on by the memory of Indeka's tearful admission of how his family was massacred after all the good they did for the humans they loved. None of the dragons that live now rule, he said instead, tilting his head. Our 3 kingdoms have ruled ourselves without even knowing who they truly were for centuries now. That's what they make you think, they're controlling things from the shadows, taking innocuous positions in order to manipulate things as they want. Have you ever met one? Dmitri asked. Marion blinked a couple of times at him. No, she said with a hint of uncertainty. What does that matter? Shouldn't you at least talk to Indek or Sethlin before you assume anything? You might be surprised by what you find out. Marion gave him a faintly incredulous look from behind her arms. You mean walk right up to a dragon and all but stick my head in its mouth? Do I look like I want to get eaten? I can go with you, if you want. I promise, I won't let you get eaten, he offered the branch to her, waiting on bated breath for what she'd do with it. Marion stared at him in silence for a moment, gray eyes flickering with confusion. Why do you care about what happens to me? She asked. She probably meant the words to be calm or prodding, but she didn't manage to suppress that meek hesitation in her voice. Why do I need a reason to? Dmitri asked, smiling kindly at her. Atra hid her smile behind her hands. Marion couldn't seem to find a response to that, she just gazed at him in bewilderment. Dmitri counted that as his first direct victory against Thales. He glanced over at Atra. Is it possible for us to get through to her? He asked without saying a word. Atra blinked twice, then smiled timidly at him. I hope so, she mouthed out. There you are. Claude's voice startled him out of his thoughts. Dmitri turned to find his prince standing in the mouth of the bakery, his eyes glowed when he took in the scene, and his grin widened just a bit more. The final war council is starting, come on. We have a lot of details to work out if we're going to storm in Bear. You're going to kill the puppet? Marion asked curiously. We're going to knock her off her throne, Dmitri allowed. Marion looked between them, her eyes storming with thought, and she then said, I can tell you what she's done to change the city's defenses, if you want. The Chancellor doesn't need her as the Emperor for her to fulfill her role. Check the description for the links to the author.